Hey guys, tonight we're taking a dimly lit stroll through a time when knights roamed castles, the church held the keys to heaven and your bedroom, and nearly every man with a title thought your uterus was part of his birthright. Yeah, this one's going to get a little weird. Also a little disturbing. You probably won't survive this, honestly. Not if you're a peasant woman with an opinion or a noble woman with a uterus. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments what city you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're born a girl in 12th century France. That's not your first mistake, just the one everyone else notices. Before you've even taken your first clumsy steps or grown your first tooth, someone is already worried about the future of your virginity. In a society obsessed with lineage, land and divine order, your body isn't just yours, it's a commodity, a fragile vessel that must be sealed, guarded and traded like fine linen or aged wine. Your virginity? That's your family's most negotiable asset. And if you're lucky, or unlucky enough to be born noble, it might even be worth a castle. Virginity isn't just a romantic ideal, it's a social currency. It determines your marriage value, your dowry negotiation, your family's reputation, and your place in heaven. Your father doesn't teach you letters or let you climb trees, but he sure teaches you to keep your legs together. Everyone does. Nuns whisper it during prayers, older women hammer it into your ear like iron nails into wood. And God? Oh, he's watching. Especially when you bathe. By the time you hit your early teens, and yes, that's marriageable age, you've learnt that your body is not only shameful but also a ticking time bomb. The moment you're suspected of losing your virginity, even without proof, your value crashes harder than a 14th century wool market. People don't ask for evidence, they ask for your silence. No blood on the sheets on your wedding night. That could ruin your family name. You get examined, humiliated, disbelieved, but also believed too much. The church plays its part like a jealous lover. From the pulpit, sermons warn against female desire, casting Eve as the blueprint of sin. Virginity is praised not just as purity, but as power. Ironically, a power that women must surrender to men. They even have saints for this stuff. St. Agnes, St. Cecilia, St. Lucy, all virgin martyrs who would rather die in gruesome ways than give up their precious holy maidenheads. One got her eyes gouged out, another were burned, one was beheaded. You grow up hearing these tales like bedtime stories. The message, better dead than deflowered. Now here's the part that's extra twisted. Virginity isn't just moral, it's political. Your intact hymen is proof of your family's honour. It proves you're untouched and therefore safe to carry on your husband's bloodline. It ensures any future heir is definitely his. No DNA tests here. Just trust and patriarchal panic. If he marries you and you've already been with someone else, he might be raising another man's child. And in a world where property, titles, and even the throne pass through bloodlines, that's not just awkward, that's treason. Some lords and kings even require a third party to verify your purity before marriage. Real people had this job. They were called matrons of honour, which sounds sweet until you realise their whole job is to prod, poke and report on your bits. There's even a quirky historical footnote. Some medieval physicians believed you could tell a virgin just by how she walked. The science? None. The creepiness? Maxed out. Here's the thing though, no one could actually see virginity. It wasn't a thing, like a coin or a certificate. It was invisible, unverifiable, and still it controlled every aspect of a girl's life. That's why it's so powerful and so dangerous. Women accused of losing it without permission, slut-shamed, imprisoned or exiled. If you were poor, you might be forced into a convent or shunned. If you were noble, you might be hidden away until a quiet marriage could cover the scandal. Or worse, punished publicly as a warning. Of course, this obsession created some weird side effects. Ever heard of chastity belts? Yeah, those spiked iron contraptions that supposedly locked up a woman's groin like a medieval lunchbox? Historians argue about whether they were real or just symbolic, or maybe invented centuries later to sell tickets to museums. Some believe they were more of a Renaissance invention, part propaganda, part paranoia. Still, they represent a powerful idea, the belief that if a man couldn't always control his wife's body, maybe he could literally lock it down. What's wild is how this obsession bled into everything: literature, art, even architecture. Castles had maidens' towers, high unreachable rooms where young noble girls were kept locked away from temptation and potential scandal. Tapestries depicted unicorns only being lured by virgins, as if even mythical beasts were part of the purity police. And troubadours? Those romantic poets sang of ladies fair and pure, but always through the lens of a man's longing and a man's control. But here's the scholarly debate. Was virginity fetishized purely to control women? Or was it also a way for powerless men, like younger sons, monks, or low-tier knights, to elevate themselves spiritually by worshipping something unattainable? Some argue that the cult of virginity was more about male insecurity than female rebellion. Others say it was a moral smokescreen for political strategy. Either way, it left real scars on real lives. And while all this policing made life miserable for women, it also created paradoxes. Virginity was idolized, but it had an expiration date. After marriage, you were expected to get pregnant immediately, preferably with a boy. You went from wholly untouched vessel to full-time baby factory. No in-between, no personal choice, just a sharp pivot from don't you dare to why aren't you pregnant yet. So tonight, as we tuck ourselves in under cozy blankets, try to imagine sleeping in a world where every part of your body is owned, watched, judged, and repurposed for someone else's legacy. All because someone somewhere decided that your value starts and ends with what you haven't done. Sweet dreams, right? So you've managed to keep your so-called purity intact. Congrats, I guess. But don't breathe too easy. Now you're a teenager, your body's blooming, and your father is eyeing you the way a merchandiser a ship full of rare spices. You're about to become part of a transaction, not the buyer, not even the goods, more like the wrapping paper. And this trade is not happening in the market square, it's happening in castles, monasteries, royal courts. Welcome to the noble marriage game, where your womb is less about you and more about cementing alliances. Your wedding isn't about love. Let's drop that fantasy right now. Love is for ballads and troubadours, not contracts signed with wax seals and bloodlines. In the world you live in, you're a tool for building power. Your father wants more land. A marriage can make that happen. Your uncle's in a blood feud with the neighbouring lord. Marry the enemy's daughter. Boom! Instant truce. These marriages are peace treaties with breasts and veils. If you're a noble woman, your body might literally be the last hope of keeping two kingdoms from stabbing each other senseless. But it's not just about politics between families, it's about succession. You're expected to birth an heir, preferably male, immediately and repeatedly. You're not even fully grown yourself, and already there's pressure to push out a miniature version of your husband, even if he's twice your age and has breath like a rotting dungeon. You go from being protected as a virgin to being inspected as a vessel. They don't say it outright, but it's there in the looks, the prayers, the thinly veiled comments from older women. Let us hope the Lord blesses your womb. Translation? Start producing or start panicking. And let's talk about how you get married. The whole ceremony is a theatre of ownership. The bride is given away, literally handed over from father to husband like a prized cow. Rings, oaths, cloaks. Every gesture screams, I own you now. Some cultures even had a ritual where the husband placed a shoe or a piece of cloth over the bride's head, symbolising dominance. Romantic, right? You've never even held a man's hand, and suddenly you're bound to serve one for life. Bonus points if he's missing half his teeth and thinks conversation is for monks and court jesters. And if you think peasants escape this, think again. Sure, their marriages are less political, more practical, but the woman's role is still largely reproductive. Farmhands needed heirs just like lords needed heirs, only instead of inheritance, it's about who milks the cow when you die. The difference, peasant women did back-breaking labour and childbirth, usually with zero medical care, and a midwife who learned her craft from whispered prayers and goat anatomy. There's a strange haunting element to these weddings, though. Something you can't shake. It's the knowledge that the man standing beside you at the altar is not marrying you for your mind, your voice, your sense of humour. He's marrying you for your uterus, specifically for the hope that it will produce male heirs who won't die of plague, war, or bad soup. And if it doesn't, well, that's your fault. Not his, never his. Infertility is a woman's sin in the Middle Ages. No one questions the man. They just eye the woman sideways and suggest more fasting, more prayers. Or worse, another wife. In royal families, this obsession gets turned up to 11. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine. brilliant, politically savvy and powerful, but reduced in reputation for failing to give Henry II more sons. Even queens get boiled down to how well they perform in the medieval baby-making Olympics, and if they don't succeed, they get locked away in towers, abandoned in monasteries, or quietly poisoned. The stakes are life and death, no pressure. And here's a bit of a quirky aside. Some nobles went so far as to test a bride's fertility before marriage. No, not like a lab test. More like a superstition-laced ritual involving moon cycles, body temperature, and sometimes, strangely enough, urine tests involving barley seeds. Yep, barley. If the grain sprouted in your pee, you were considered fertile. If not, well, maybe you'd be sent to God early, or just married off to some lesser lord who didn't mind gambling with your womb. Now, scholars argue about whether these women had any say in the process. Some suggest noble women used marriage as a tool too, manipulating alliances from behind the scenes. And yes, a few clever, powerful women managed to play the game to their advantage. But most had no say at all. The marriage contract was between men, your father, your future husband, sometimes even your king. Your job was to be agreeable and compliant, or at least quiet. After the wedding, you move into your husband's estate, far from your family, and immediately the scrutiny begins. Are you walking strangely? Could that mean you're pregnant? Did you skip a meal? Are you barren? Even your servants start whispering. You get visited by your husband's mother, his sisters, his priest, all asking polite, terrifying questions about your monthly flow and your appetite. It's like being a one-woman fertility experiment with zero say and maximum judgment. And when you do get pregnant, congratulations, you've bought yourself 9 months of praise. But don't get too comfortable, because if the baby's a girl, your triumph gets downgraded to a polite shrug. If it's a boy, you're a saint, a miracle, a walking trophy. And if the baby dies, that's your fault too. Maybe you walked too far, maybe you didn't pray enough, maybe God is punishing your family, or maybe, medieval medicine is just abysmal. So much of this is grounded in fear of disorder, fear of illegitimate heirs, fear of women having any power outside reproduction. By tying a woman's value to her ability to produce noble sons, medieval men kept a tight grip on inheritance, property, and legacy. Control the body, control the future. That was the logic. It was brutal, but it worked. For them. Tonight, as your fan hums softly and the lights dim around you, imagine lying in a canopied bed beneath thick woolen blankets, your stomach already swelling with a child, and knowing that your entire worth, your safety, your future, even your soul is measured not in what you do, but in what your body can give someone else. You wake before the bells. The monastery bells toll like a slow heartbeat, pulling light through the stained glass windows. You're already sore from sleep, pregnant, or trying to be, or praying not to be, depending on which part of your life you've landed in. And just beyond your chamber walls is the great whispering thing, the church. It seeps into your life like incense, sweet and choking. It tells you what to eat, how to love, when to confess, and most importantly, what your body is allowed to do. If you think your husband runs your body, think again. He's just middle management. The church is the CEO of your soul. And your womb. They don't phrase it like that, of course. They phrase it with stained glass halos and Latin verses. But make no mistake, the medieval church is obsessed with controlling sex, and more specifically, women's access to it. Sexuality is framed as dangerous, shameful, and above all female. Lust isn't just a sin, it's a woman's sin. Eve started it, remember? She took a bite, she tempted Adam, and boom! Painful childbirth and eternal damnation for everyone. Cool story, bro. So here you are, walking through a world built on Eve's alleged mistake. You don't just carry the consequence of sin, you embody it. Theologians like Augustine spin these dizzying webs of logic. Women are weaker, more carnal, closer to the animal than men. Therefore they must be kept in check. Sex is only holy inside marriage, and only then for procreation, not pleasure. If you enjoy it, that's a problem. If you cause your husband to enjoy it too much, that's a double sin. Now imagine being a teenager hearing this every Sunday. Your body is dangerous, your desires are betrayal, and your best hope for salvation is through obedient suffering. And don't even think about showing your hair. That's a scandal waiting to happen. Some monks argued that a woman's uncovered hair could cause a man to sin just by fluttering in the breeze. So you cover it. You lower your eyes. You walk like temptation wrapped in guilt. And here comes the big contradiction. While sex is sinful, producing children is sacred. That means you're stuck in this moral limbo where you're expected to have sex, but never enjoy it. You're a vessel, not a person. The Church's job, as they see it, is to walk the tightrope for you, allow just enough sexuality to sustain the population, but not so much that people start having fun, especially women. Confession becomes a minefield. You kneel in the wooden booth, whispering your sins, if you dared to touch yourself or if you felt warmth during intercourse. Yes, that's how they worded it. Feeling warmth. Sounds cozy. It's not. The priest tells you to pray more, fast, wash yourself with cold water, mortify the flesh, maybe sleep on a board for a while. This isn't just spiritual advice, it's bodily control disguised as salvation. Here's a bizarre little fringe fact. Some monks believed that even married sex was only permissible on certain days. Definitely not on Sundays, feast days, Lent, Advent, or during menstruation. If you added all those up, you'd get maybe 100 safe days a year. And God forbid you got pregnant outside the spiritually approved window. That might be why some women kept calendars, not for feasts, but for sin cycles. Trying to be a holy wife was like playing moral hopscotch in a minefield. Still, some women internalise this. They become the moral police in their own homes, scolding daughters for loose bodices and boys for looking too long. You've got noble ladies flagellating themselves with hair shirts beneath their gowns, terrified that their beauty might be a trap for men. And in convents, girls who join at age 10 are already taught to loathe their flesh, to fast until they faint, to scrub their skin raw with vinegar. The more you suffer, the more you purify. That was the deal. But not everyone agrees on the rules. Scholarly debate in cloisters and theological circles bubbles under the surface. Some argue that sex in marriage is a holy act. Others insist it's a regrettable necessity, like bleeding a patient or burning a heretic. The real tension here? No one agrees on how much control is too much. Even bishops are confused. Is pleasure always sin? Is a wife ever allowed to initiate intimacy? What happens if she says no? The Church hems and haws but never gives a clear answer, because ambiguity keeps control in the hands of confessors, not believers. And guess who doesn't get asked? You, the woman, the one actually living in the body they're all so scared of. There are no panels of midwives deciding doctrine, no pregnant peasants invited to the cathedral council, just men with robes and scrolls debating how often you're allowed to bathe without tempting the devil. It's not just doctrine, it's art too. You walk into a cathedral and see Eve again naked and shamed, while Adam looks mildly confused. You look up at the fresco and there's Mary, serene, clothed, glowing with virtue. These are your choices, Eve or Mary, temptress or virgin, whore or saint. There's no middle lane, and heaven forbid you fall outside those roles. Say you're widowed and don't remarry, or you're barren, or you just don't care about sex at all. People start talking. Is she a witch? Is she possessed? Is she secretly meeting someone in the woods? Because in a world this rigid, the mere act of not conforming is threatening. But here's a twist. Some women use the system, clever ones. They learn the prayers, earn the priest's trust, and maneuver their way into influence. Some rise to become abbesses, women who rule convents, lands, and communities. They quote scripture better than bishops, write letters to popes, and occasionally even push back against the rules. Are they still trapped in the machine? Yes, but they're pulling levers from inside the gears. So tonight, as you lie back and your breath slows, think of yourself with the weight of centuries-old sermons pressing down on your ribs. Your body has been theologized, judged, and made into a battlefield between sin and virtue. And all you wanted, maybe, was to walk barefoot through the grass without feeling like every movement of your hips needed absolution. Sleep tight, saint or sinner. You're 13, maybe 14. Old enough to bleed, old enough to marry, old enough to burn. At least that's what they'll say when they come knocking. Not for marriage this time. Not for a dowry negotiation or a blessing. This time it's worse. This time they're coming because you know too much. Or maybe you helped someone give birth. Or you handed out a pouch of dried herbs and told your cousin to steep it in warm water and rest. Whatever it was, you've stepped outside your lane. You've acted like your body, and the bodies of other women, might actually belong to you. And that's dangerous. Because now, suddenly you're not a girl. You're a witch. It starts with whispers, always. A stillbirth in the village, a cow stops giving milk, a man's leg rots after falling in the stream. People want a reason. a shape to the misfortune, and the church has been planting that shape for decades. Female, midwife, healer, wise, poor, unmarried, independent. Basically you. Midwives are first on the chopping block. They've spent centuries doing what male doctors can't or won't. Delivering babies, saving women in labour, knowing which herbs ease pain and which ones end pregnancies. They know too much about blood, too much about death. They're often old, often childless, and often terrifying in their certainty. And so, of course, they're painted as demonic. You watched one once. She showed you how to mix mugwort and pennyroyal. Not for dark rituals, just to calm cramps, maybe to bring on a late period. But those herbs are sacred and secret and powerful, and you're not supposed to hold that kind of power. Not without robes, not without Latin. So when things go wrong, they come for the wise women first, the herbalists, the lonely, the sharp-tongued. You're hauled before a tribunal of men who've never bled, but believe they know what the devil does to a womb. They ask you if you've laid with Satan, if he visited you in the night, if you flew on a broomstick, if you danced naked in the woods. They don't want truth. They want a confession to fit their fear. Some of them believe it. Some are just playing along. Some are using it as cover to silence women who scared them. And let's be honest, smart women in the Middle Ages do scare people, especially if they have knowledge passed down outside the church, beyond the guilds, outside male control. Here's the eerie part. The line between healer and heretic is razor thin. The very skills that saved lives, birthing techniques, herbal remedies, practical anatomy, are now being framed as black magic. You knew how to calm a labouring woman? That's sorcery. You touched a bleeding thigh without fainting? You've got unholy courage. You brought someone back from fever. You must be working with demons. Suddenly care becomes crime. There's a famous medieval manual that fans the flames. Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Published in the late 1400s, it's basically the ultimate how-to guide for spotting and torturing witches. And spoiler alert, it's obsessed with women's bodies. It accuses women of having insatiable lust, weak minds, and a natural tendency toward evil. According to it, women are more likely to become witches because they're more impressionable and carnal. Real science, huh? And if you're thinking, wait, wasn't this more of an early modern phenomenon? You're not wrong. The real peak of witch hunting came later, but the seeds are planted in the medieval mindset. The fear of uncontrolled female knowledge, especially about sex, birth, and the body, was deeply medieval, and it paved the road to those later fires. But here's the fringe detail. Some accused witches confessed, without to torture. They claimed they really did fly or speak with spirits, or cure through supernatural means. Were they deluded, lying under pressure, or was it a kind of reclaiming, a last act of resistance in a world that already condemned them? Scholars argue over this. Some say it was a form of rebellion, others say trauma and coercion warped reality, but the fact that anyone would want to confess to being powerful in a world that punished power, that's a story in itself. And let's not forget the role of envy, and neighbours' crops fail while yours flourish. Suspicious. Your body still works while other women suffer miscarriages? Suspicious. Your husband died young, leaving you with a little independence and land? Very suspicious. This isn't just about sex or sin, it's about control. You're dangerous because you live just outside the system, and the system doesn't like that. The punishment? It varies. In some places, you're burned. In others, drowned or hanged. Sometimes you're locked away in a nunnery, stripped of your identity, forced to repent for things you didn't do. And the questions they ask you? They're about your body, where the devil touched you, what part of you changed shape, whether you bled when you swore your pact. Your physical self becomes the evidence. Even in death you're inspected, examined, prodded, reduced. But here's a twist. The church is not the only culprit. Women accuse women too. Mothers-in-law, jealous neighbours, angry midwives turned informants. Why? Because fear is infectious. Because survival sometimes means pointing the finger elsewhere. Because when your whole world revolves around keeping your head down, the easiest way to survive is to help keep someone else's down lower. And this fear changes how you move. You hide your knowledge, you stop mixing herbs, you pretend you're afraid of blood. You act helpless in childbirth even when you know better. You watch your tongue, your walk, your laughter. You wrap your power in silence, because even a whisper of the wrong thing can make someone see horns where there are none. So as you pull the blanket up to your chin tonight, picture yourself in a quiet village, surrounded by hills and meadows, and feel how the air changes when someone says the word witch. It's a word soaked in control, in ignorance, and patriarchy disguised as piety. And for you, it's a word that could end everything. Sleep gently, wise one. You're sitting on a rough wooden bench, skirts tucked modestly around your ankles, and your hands folded like you've been taught. Across the room, a priest stands with a parchment scroll and a candle, preaching about the fall of man, but really it's the fall of woman. He reads from Genesis, carefully, emphatically, almost smugly. The story is burned into your brain by now. Eve, the apple, the serpent, the original sin. You've heard it 1,000 times in sermons, in songs, carved into cathedral stone like a warning, and every time it sinks a little deeper. Your body, your pain, your desires, all inherited punishments. They call it Eve's curse. It's shorthand for what's happening inside you every month. The cramping, the bleeding, the fatigue that drapes your bones in fog. It isn't biology here, it's theology. It's cosmic retribution. You're not shedding uterine lining, you're being reminded that Eve brought death into the world, and now your body has to suffer for it. Forever. The priest doesn't whisper this. He proclaims it, as if your suffering is a kind of sacred penance, like your uterus is apologizing on a schedule. And it doesn't stop with menstruation. The whole idea of childbirth pain comes from the same place. Divine punishment. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. That's the line. They say it's what God told Eve, right before kicking her out of paradise. And that line becomes the foundation for centuries of normalized female suffering. You scream during labour? Good. That means it's working. It means you're paying your debt. Of course, there were some theologians who softened the message, suggesting that women could redeem themselves through motherhood, that the Virgin Mary gave you a new path. But still, pain remained the toll for being born female. If you tried to ease it, with herbs, chants, help from another woman, that was risky. Pain was holy. Avoiding it was heresy. Now, here's the bit that rarely makes it into the stained glass windows. Not everyone in the church agreed on what Eve's curse actually meant. Some said it referred only to physical suffering, menstruation and childbirth. Others claimed it extended to subordination itself, that women must obey men as punishment for Eve's defiance. A few even insisted that men were cursed too through labour and toil. But, let's be real, no one tattooed that on the walls of the cathedral. And let's not pretend that these ideas stayed in the pulpit. They soaked into daily life. You're taught that women are naturally more gullible, more emotional, more prone to temptation, that your thoughts are like garden weeds, untrustworthy unless pulled up by confession or male instruction. Your body? It's a site of weakness, of danger. You're told to fear it, to hide it, to treat its every natural function like a moral crisis. During your moon time, you're considered unclean, literally. Some religious orders ban women from entering the church while menstruating. Others claim your touch can sour wine, kill crops, or cause bread to go mouldy. These aren't metaphors, they're believed facts. In one infamous text, it suggested that if a menstruating woman walks through a field, she'll burn the crops just by her presence. Your body becomes a blight just for doing what it was built to do, and it doesn't stop there. Marriage doesn't erase the suspicion. If anything, it heightens it. You're expected to be sexually available to your husband, but still holy, still untouched in spirit. Too much desire? That's Eve again. Too little? That's pride. Your only safe path is silence. Submission. Obedience wrapped in patience, pain dressed as piety. Here's a fringe belief that sums up the absurdity. In certain parts of Europe, some people believed that menstruating women could summon storms. Thunderstorms. Just by existing. You might laugh now, but imagine growing up in a cottage where your mother warns you not to go outside during your bleeding days in case your presence curses the animals. Imagine internalizing that. Feeling like your body isn't just shameful, it's dangerous. And if you think this only applies to peasants or simple townsfolk, think again. Even learned men, doctors, priests, scholars, quoted these beliefs as medical truth. Menstrual blood was thought to be poisonous. Physicians warned that it could corrode mirrors, blacken iron, and make dogs go mad. Your body was literally a chemical weapon, according to medieval science. But here's the kicker. None of this stops you from being expected to bear children. In fact, all this shame and mythology is stuffed into a tight, contradictory box. You're dirty and dangerous, but also sacred. You're a weak, sin-prone vessel, but also a potential mother of saints. The same men who fear your blood will turn around and praise you when you're visibly pregnant, as though holiness has finally colonized your insubordinate body. Some women push back quietly. A few brave souls begin to reinterpret Eve. They write poems that cast her not as the villain, but as the first seeker of knowledge. A woman who dared to want more. In hidden letters and forbidden books, women theologians, yes, they existed, begin to poke holes in the doctrine. Could it be that Eve was wise, that the curse was a warning story, not a divine mandate? These are dangerous ideas, but they flicker, even now, like candles behind locked chapel doors. Still, most women accept the curse as fact. What choice do you have? When the entire culture is built on the foundation that your pain is deserved, your joy is suspicious, and your bleeding is a moral flaw, it takes more than courage to question it. It takes isolation, rejection, and sometimes you just don't have the strength to fight what the world insists is divine order. So you bow your head. You fold your hands. You thank God for your suffering, even as it unravels you. You learn to smile through the pain, to see your own agony as a kind of currency for spiritual reward. And the saddest part? Sometimes it works. Sometimes, when you're on your knees on a cold stone floor, blood between your legs, your head full of scripture, you really do feel holy. Tonight, as you settle under your blanket and your heartbeat slows, imagine a life where your own body feels like both a weapon and a sentence, where every drop of blood whispers a reminder that you are descended from a woman who dared to reach, and the world has been punishing you for it ever since. It starts like this: a few cramps, a little ache behind your hips, a quiet silence in your belly that should feel normal but doesn't. Then your midwife leans in and says something you've heard a dozen times, except this time it sounds like a sentence, not a blessing. It's coming. Childbirth, the great equalizer. Whether you're a milkmaid or a queen, this is the moment your body becomes public property. Not in name, maybe, but in practice. Because once the baby decides it's time, your pain becomes everyone's business, especially the men who claim to be in charge. Pregnancy was always framed as sacred, miraculous even. The Virgin Mary looms over your pregnancy like a ghostly supervisor, all perfect glow and zero sweat. But when the contractions start and your bones feel like they are about to shatter from the inside out, nobody's quoting scripture anymore. They are praying, loudly, for you and for the baby and for the family line, and, let's be honest, for the father's reputation. Because here's the quiet horror of medieval childbirth. You're expendable. The baby, the bloodline, that's what matters. If you die, God's will. If you survive, God's mercy. The room where you give birth is filled with women. Midwives, mothers, neighbours, sometimes even servants. Men stay out, at least physically. But their presence still looms, written into every prayer, every panic. Midwives are often trained by other women, not universities, because medical schools ban females. And even though they've delivered hundreds of babies, even though they know what to do when the umbilical cord wraps or the baby won't turn, their knowledge is considered inferior. Folk knowledge, dangerous knowledge, knowledge that only counts when it confirms what the male doctors already believe. Which is funny, because most male doctors, they've never even seen a birth. They write treatises based on the theories of Galen or Hippocrates, ancient Greek guys who thought wombs wandered around the body like lost cats and that women's insides were just colder, inverted versions of men's. Real groundbreaking stuff. But still, if something goes wrong, it's often the male physician who's summoned, late, unprepared, and armed with more opinions than experience. And when things go wrong, they go very wrong. Childbirth in the Middle Ages is brutal. No anaesthesia, no sanitation, no antibiotics. If the labour stalls, if the babies breach, if there's too much blood, the best you can hope for is a good midwife with steady hands and strong nerves. The worst? A priest standing at your bedside to give last rites while your family tries to choose between saving the baby or saving you. And here's a grim fringe detail. Some church officials believed that if a baby died before baptism, its soul was lost, gone, doomed to limbo or worse. That meant midwives had to learn how to perform emergency baptisms, sometimes even before the baby was fully born. They'd whisper prayers into the bloody silence between pushes, sprinkle holy water on a half-delivered head, hoping it was enough. Can you imagine that pressure? You're barely breathing, trying not to die, and someone's kneeling beside you muttering sacred words to save a soul in case it slips away with the next contraction. And the mother? If she dies, she's remembered in prayers. Maybe in a small painted icon if she was noble, maybe not at all if she was a servant. Either way, it's seen as part of the price. God gave women the gift of childbirth, and with it the risk of death. Like a wrapped present with a snake inside, you're expected to accept it with grace. But don't get the idea that all the women were passive in this. Some fought for control, over their bodies, over their births. Some refused male doctors. Some bribed midwives for potions to speed things along or dull the pain. Some insisted on birthing in upright positions, gripping wooden poles or kneeling on straw instead of lying back like a broken doll the way some doctors preferred. In Italy, a few women even wrote childbirth manuals. Yes, actual medieval instruction books, based on observation and experience, not just theory. But their voices were small, tucked in the margins, often ignored. And here's where the contradictions swirl like smoke. The Church condemned female pleasure but celebrated motherhood. It feared women's bodies but needed them to produce new Christians. It denied women positions of religious power but allowed them to hold life and death in their hands during birth. That tension never really went away, it just got deeper. Now, add social pressure to the mix. You're expected to produce sons, healthy ones, no pressure, right? If the baby's a girl, you get a polite nod. If it's a boy, the bells might ring. And if you fail to carry to term more than once, people start to talk. Maybe you're cursed. Maybe it's something you ate. Maybe you didn't pray hard enough, or you upset a saint. It's always you, never your husband. He could be firing blanks like a broken trebuchet, and no one would dare suggest it. Here's where things get even darker. Some women, noble women especially, died not just from childbirth itself, but from repeat pregnancies stacked one after another. No recovery time, no birth control, just constant cycles of swelling, bleeding, and hoping this time the baby lives. That's your job, that's your worth. And eventually your body gives out. And still, people keep saying childbirth is a blessing. So tonight, as you lie there in your quiet room, maybe clutching a pillow or curling on your side, think about the women who lay in straw-strewn chambers, sweat pooling under their backs, surrounded by whispering women and anxious prayers, women who knew the risks, who faced them anyway, who had no choice, who carried life inside them like a ticking clock counting down to a moment that could bring joy or grief or both at once. And they did it again, and again and again. Sleep now. You've earned it. You're sick. Not the kind of sick that stops the world, but the kind that starts rumours. Maybe it's a fever. Maybe your stomach twists in new ways. Maybe you just feel wrong, off, so your family calls the doctor. Which sounds reassuring until you remember what that really means in your century. He's a man who wears thick wool robes year-round, carries a pouch of leeches, and believes your womb might be migrating up into your throat. Yep, medicine in the Middle Ages is basically a dangerous blend of superstition, ego, and occasional guesswork. And if you're a woman, the guesswork gets extra imaginative. The doctor arrives with an entourage of smells: clove, sweat, ink, and decay. He doesn't ask you how you feel. He asks when you last bled. He doesn't look you in the eye. He looks at your wrists, your neck, your urine. He might taste it, squinting into the cup like he's judging a bad wine. He asks if you've had unnatural thoughts. He might ask if your husband has been fulfilling his duties, which is a polite way of saying he's about to blame you for your own suffering, and then blame your husband for your womb acting out. It's a 2-for-1. According to prevailing theory, your body is governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health is all about balance, illness is imbalance, too hot, too cold, too moist, too dry. Women, of course, are categorised as naturally colder and wetter, basically more unstable. Too much bleeding? You've got excess blood, not bleeding enough. The blood's turning into poison. That's not metaphorical, by the way. They literally think trapped menstrual blood rots inside you and causes hysteria. This brings us to wandering womb syndrome. Yes, that's a real diagnosis in medieval Europe. They believed that if you didn't have regular sex or childbirth, your uterus could literally travel around your body, like it's got legs, up to your lungs, even your brain, choking and confusing you. Symptoms of this so-called uterus on tour include dizziness, anxiety, fainting, choking, mood swings, and, brace yourself, reading too much. Treatment. Well, some doctors recommend strong-smelling herbs placed near the nose and between the legs to lure the womb back into position. Others prescribe marriage and frequent sex, because, obviously, a pregnant womb is a well-behaved womb. That's the logic. If you're single or widowed, this diagnosis is practically inevitable. You're basically walking around with a live grenade in your abdomen, according to them. And even when the diagnosis is less absurd, the treatment still leaves you exposed. Bleeding is common, not from injury, from intent. Doctors love to bleed their patients, especially women. They believe it balances your humours, so you might find yourself with a vein opened, blood trickling into a bowl, while your body tries to recover from an illness you don't understand, diagnosed by a man who thinks your uterus has GPS. Still, doctors aren't the only option. You might also seek help from a local wise woman who knows how to crush lavender and yarrow and wrap the leaves just so. Her cures smell earthy and make more sense. But as we already explored, trusting her is risky. One wrong outcome, one suspicious neighbour, and she's a witch. And if she's a witch, you might be her accomplice. Some women try to take matters into their own hands. They use herbs, some passed down from mothers and aunts, some written in books hidden under floorboards. They might brew a tea of rue or pennyroyal for cramps. Some of these herbs work, some are dangerous, but most of all they represent something medieval medicine hates: female autonomy. Your knowledge of your own body is threatening, and the fact that it often works better than the doctor's bleeding bowl, that's downright treasonous. This tension between female bodies and male medicine shows up in texts too. There's a medieval gynecological guide called the Trotula, written in Salerno, Italy, and surprisingly ahead of its time. It covers everything from menstrual issues to infertility, and scholars still debate whether it was written by a woman. If it was, that's huge. If not, then someone had the sense to at least gather real female insight. Either way, the fact that this book existed and circulated shows a flicker of awareness. Women's bodies aren't just weaker versions of men's, they are different, and they need different care. But good luck finding someone who treats you like an expert in your own body. If you faint, you're dramatic. If you cry, you're unstable. If you complain of stomach pain, they call it vapours. If you refuse intimacy, you're cold. If you seek it, you're possessed. Every move you make gets filtered through a fog of suspicion and pseudoscience. You can't win, your body isn't sick, you are. And here's a strange little footnote from history. There was a belief that staring at a beautiful woman too long could make a man physically ill, like pale skin, weak knees, coughing blood. The cure? Often marrying the woman, or in less polite cases, laying with her. So not only is your body blamed for your own illnesses, it's blamed for men's too. Scholars still argue over how much of this was deliberate control, and how much was just sincere ignorance. Some claim that medieval doctors were simply doing their best with what they had. Others insist the system worked exactly as intended, to confuse, control, and medicalize femininity. It's likely both. But whatever the intent, the result is the same. You exist in a world where your pain is either invisible or exaggerated, and in either case someone else holds the prescription pad. So tonight, as your body settles into the mattress and your breath softens, imagine lying on a straw-stuffed bed while someone with ink-stained fingers places a leech behind your ear. Imagine being told that your womb is disobedient, your blood unruly, and your voice too shrill for healing. And then, imagine how fiercely you'd want to whisper, "No, I know what's wrong. I know my own body. Just listen." But they won't, not yet. The church bells toll again, and this time you're not in bed or kneeling in a pew. You're on your knees in the dirt, somewhere behind a crumbling monastery wall, listening to an old woman whisper the story of St. Margaret of Antioch. She tells it like a legend, but there's an edge to her voice, something more than reverence, maybe fear, maybe awe, because St. Margaret, like so many others, didn't just die for her faith. She was destroyed because she protected her virginity, and in the Middle Ages, that's the highest form of body horror. A woman so devoted to purity that she'd rather be torn limb from limb than let a man touch her. You know the stories. They're everywhere. In manuscripts, in cathedral murals, in the chants sung by sleepy novices. There's St. Agnes, who rejected a Roman officer and was sentenced to death, but miraculously remained naked without shame because her hair grew to cover her body. St. Agatha, whose breasts were cut off when she refused a suitor, and who was later healed by a vision of St. Peter. St. Lucy, who gouged out her own eyes to prevent a man from lusting after her. And then there's St. Margaret herself, swallowed whole by a dragon and burst free from its belly by making the sign of the cross from inside. These women are legends, but they're also warnings. Their stories get passed down as examples of virtue, but really they're stories of mutilation, bloody, graphic, violent, and they're paraded as moral victories. Your purity is so sacred, the church says, that losing it is worse than death. These girls become spiritual warriors by making their bodies the battlefield. And if that battlefield is scorched, maimed, or carved up by torturers, well, that's just part of the sanctity. It's disturbing but also seductive in a twisted way. These martyrs are given halos. Their names are remembered. They are celebrated because they were ruined. And so you start to wonder, is this what it takes to be holy? Do you have to die to be respected? Is your body only valuable when it's bleeding in the right context? On the birthing bed, the battlefield, or the pyre? There's a deeply creepy undercurrent here. These saints are often teenage girls, barely older than you. Their stories are told by grown men, copied by monks, illustrated with way too much detail in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. There's a whole genre of medieval art that shows these saints mid-martyrdom. Eyes gouged, breasts severed, limbs torn but faces serene. It's like suffering itself becomes eroticized, not in the modern obvious sense, but in the way these images invite both pity and admiration, horror and desire. You start to feel like your body isn't your own story, it's a canvas for someone else's morality play. And here's a quirky, lesser-known fact. Some of these saints became incredibly popular not just for their suffering, but because they became uncorrupted. Their corpses didn't decay. Pilgrims would travel for days just to see St. Catherine's mummified finger or St. Clare's glass coffin. People believed their bodies were preserved as proof of their holiness, as if the divine had stepped in to halt the natural rot, protecting what was once untouched. It's a beautiful idea until you realise the implication. The only perfect female body is a dead one, untouched by sex, preserved in glass, silent forever. But not everyone bought into the saint cult. Some thinkers, especially women, quietly questioned whether all this glorified suffering was really divinely inspired, or just social control wrapped in gold leaf. A few scholars even debated whether the stories were exaggerated, or worse, fabricated. Did Lucy really pluck out her eyes, or was that a symbol misread by generations of overzealous scribes? Historians still argue about it, but the stories were powerful regardless of their truth. What's more interesting is how these legends shaped behaviour. Parents named daughters after these martyrs, hoping for obedient, pious children. Girls were told to read the saints' lives, to learn how to resist temptation, even if it meant mutilation. And for many, these stories weren't hypothetical. They were blueprints. You grow up absorbing the idea that pain is purity, that suffering is sanctity, that your body is meant to be a vessel for something bigger than yourself, even if that thing is fire, blades, or wild animals. And this message seeps into everyday life. If a man makes advances and you resist, you're compared to a saint. If you don't resist, well, now you're Eve again. Either way, you're being measured against someone else's nightmare. You're praised for being untouchable, but also expected to marry, to serve, to submit. The contradiction never stops. You're asked to embody the virgin martyr and the fertile mother, all in the same breath. This double role creates a constant sense of failure. You're never quite good enough. Too pure and you're accused of coldness. Too open and you're a harlot. Too devout and you're strange. Not devout enough and you're a danger. And always your body is the metric. Not your kindness, not your mind, not your work, your body, what it does, what it refuses to do, what it endures. So what do you do? Some girls join convents. Not out of calling, but survival. Better to be a bride of Christ than a pawn in someone else's marriage alliance. Better to choose a life of fasting and prayer than risk your virtue on the battlefield of marriage. But even there, the martyr stories haunt you. The bloodless saint is always nearby, reminding you that true holiness requires a bit of body horror. As you sink into your pillow tonight, the air heavy with the stillness that only arrives at midnight, try to imagine sleeping with those stories tucked under your skin. Imagine believing that if you died horribly enough, you might earn a place in the stained glass, that your suffering might be turned into beauty, your pain into legend, that your only escape from control might be sainthood, if you're lucky, or death, if you're not. There's a moment in every medieval woman's life when she realises that birth and death aren't opposites, they're roommates. And that moment usually happens when you're lying flat on a board, belly taut, sweating, gasping, with your eyes on the wooden rafters and your ears tuned to the midwife's muttering. You're about to give birth again, And while that might be considered holy by the church and heroic by your neighbours, to you it feels like a knife's edge. One misstep, one bad angle, one sneeze from fate and you're gone. But this time, as your contractions start to build, something's off. The baby isn't moving right. The pushing doesn't help. The midwife's face darkens. There's blood too much, and a silence falls over the room like fog. Then comes the phrase you never want to hear in labour: go fetch the priest. Here's where things get grim, because once the priest is summoned, it's not about medicine anymore. It's about the afterlife. You're no longer a woman in childbirth, you're a soul teetering on the edge of salvation. The priest arrives with oil and murmured Latin, and while the midwives try to keep your body grounded in this world, the church starts preparing you for the next. Your body is being tugged in two directions, by life and by holy protocol. But here's the kicker. Even in this moment, even with blood soaking your thighs and death breathing down your neck, the people around you are still worried about the baby's soul more than yours. That baby needs baptism. Now, if it dies unbaptized, the theology says it can't enter heaven. So the midwife's hands are trembling not just with urgency, but with metaphysical panic. She might perform an emergency baptism while the baby is still half inside you. She sprinkles holy water, whispers the sacred words, and hopes God accepts it. Hopes that in this moment of chaos, she got it right. And you're screaming into a pillow, or maybe you've already stopped screaming. Maybe your vision has tunneled to black. And still, you're not the centre of this room. Your body is, your function, your production of new life. That's what matters. You are the vessel, the passage, the necessary suffering. You are the means, not the end. This kind of sacred brutality isn't limited to emergencies. It's woven into the very structure of how childbirth is treated. Some cities have religious orders tasked with visiting labouring women. They offer blessings, holy relics, and whispered prayers. These women are seen as both spiritually vulnerable and spiritually powerful, dangerous liminal beings hovering between life and death. In some traditions, women in childbirth aren't even allowed to touch consecrated items. You're bleeding, impure, too close to death's door. You're sacred and unclean in the same breath. And if you die, well, your soul is ideally prepared. That's the silver lining. Your sins scrubbed by pain, your penance paid in blood. Some believe that dying in childbirth was like martyrdom, a ticket straight to heaven, especially if the baby lived. The irony of this doctrine is that it sounds compassionate, but underneath it's a cold reassurance. Your death was useful. But let's rewind. Say you survive. Congratulations. You've passed the first test. But your body isn't done being controlled. Not by a long shot. Your postpartum life is tightly governed by rituals called a churching. That's when, after about 6 weeks, you're allowed to be purified and return to church. You kneel at the altar while a priest prays over you, reintroducing you to the sacred world. Until then, you're considered unclean. It doesn't matter how faithful you are. Your bleeding body has made you spiritually suspect, so you wait. You rest. Or rather, you're supposed to. In reality, your newborn needs you. Your husband might already be impatient and the house won't clean itself. The churching ritual is both a blessing and a scolding. It says, well done, now get back in line. You're now a mother, yes, but also reintegrated into society under the same old terms. Obedient, modest, services ale. Nothing about childbirth changes the power structure. It just gives you another job to do. And if your baby dies, that's another kind of horror. The loss is yours to carry, but the interpretation belongs to others. Maybe God's punishing you. Maybe you sinned. Maybe your womb is cursed. You'll get looks, pitying ones, skeptical ones, even cruel ones. If you lose more than one child, people stop being subtle. They start calling you barren, unlucky, dangerous. Sometimes you're treated like a human omen. No one says it outright, but the idea seeps in. A woman who cannot bring life safely into the world is something less than a woman. The most painful part? You probably start to believe it. And here's a little-known historical twist. In some parts of Europe, women who died in childbirth were buried with white veils, as if they were brides of Christ. Their gravestones often had symbols not of family, but of suffering. A broken lily, a cut-open rose. They were seen as sacrifices, not people. Their deaths were aestheticized, canonized, turned into quiet cautionary tales. But scholars still debate whether this was all spiritual manipulation or sincere reverence. Were these rituals meant to comfort grieving families? Or were they another layer of control? Another way to frame female suffering as divine duty. The lines blur. Sometimes the answer is both. And yet, through all of this, women keep going. They hold their babies, they comfort each other, they develop secret knowledge, tricks to ease the pain, herbs to stop bleeding, songs to calm infants, ways to stitch up wounds with nothing but thread and bravery. The system doesn't give them much, but they build a kind of sisterhood anyway. A web of resilience beneath the official rituals. You learn early. If you want to survive, you need women who understand your body the way the church never will. So tonight, as you close your eyes and the world quiets down around you, think of those women, half saint, half survivor, who lay in dark rooms, gripping hands, sweating through prayer, carving strength from pain. Think of how close they came to death, how often they weren't given the credit, and how often they rose anyway. Because that's what women did, every day, somewhere beyond the edge of the village, past the fields, past the shallow stream that ices over in winter. There's a stone wall with high windows and iron-bound doors. Behind it, cloaked in silence and ritual, lives a different kind of woman, or at least that's what they say. She's not a mother, not a wife, not a witch or a virgin martyr. She's something else entirely. A nun, or maybe a girl who didn't want to marry, or maybe just someone inconvenient. Because in medieval Europe, the cloister is many things: a sanctuary, a prison, a loophole and a warning. You might be here by choice, some women are. Maybe you crave solitude or education or a life where you could think without being watched. But chances are you weren't the one who made the final call. Fathers send daughters to convents like they're solving a math problem. Too many mouths to feed? Send one to God, no dowry, no problem. Become a bride of Christ, too rebellious, too smart, too mouthy? The cloister will fix her. The walls are thick and the rules stricter than any marriage. And once you're inside, you vanish from the world. Your name changes. Your clothes vanish, traded for a habit, black or white depending on the order. Your hair is cut short or shaved. You no longer belong to yourself. Your body becomes sacred by becoming invisible. No husband, no children, no household. Just silence, prayer, and an ever-watching eye above. On the surface it sounds like safety. No childbirth, no unwanted touch, no constant fear of pregnancy or judgment. You rise with the bells, chant the psalms, tend the garden, copy sacred texts. You learn to read if you're lucky, maybe even Latin. You might sing in Latin too, lifting your voice in cold stone halls while the morning sun cuts through high-coloured windows. There's peace here, a strange kind of peace. But make no mistake, it's not freedom, not really. Because even in the cloister your body isn't yours. Your days are scheduled down to the hour: matins, lauds, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. Each prayer is tied to time, and each moment is tied to obedience. If you fall ill, you confess it. If you bleed, you hide it. If you speak too loudly, you're reprimanded. Some convents are strict enough that sisters aren't allowed to talk at all except during designated hours. Imagine living in a world of women and being forbidden to speak. Still, nuns find ways to carve out autonomy. They write. Some become scribes, artists, poets, mystics. Take Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess who composed music, wrote theological treatises, studied plants and medicine, and had visions she insisted were divine. She pushed boundaries from inside the system. She wasn't the only one. Across Europe, cloistered women begin to shape culture in quiet, radical ways. They exchange letters, interpret scripture, compile herbal manuals, even critique church doctrine, just subtly enough not to get burned for it. But others aren't so lucky. For every Hildegard, there's a girl locked away not for mysticism, but for being born into the wrong moment. Some nuns arrive at age 6 or 7, not knowing why. They're placed in a world they didn't choose, with vows they didn't understand and told to call it a blessing. In some monasteries, young girls are walled into small one-room cells called anchor holds, permanent enclosures with no exit. A tiny window allows bread and water, another lets them hear Mass. They live like this for decades, voluntarily, supposedly. And here's the twisted thing: these anchorites were revered. They were believed to be closer to God, removed from worldly temptation. Pilgrims would come to ask them for advice, leave offerings at their window. Some even gained fame. But if you strip the piety away, what's left is a woman locked in a room until she dies, because she refused to fit the mould. And fitting the mould is always the point. Whether you're in a convent or a castle, your role is defined in opposition to men. In the cloister, you're valuable because you don't bear children, because you don't tempt. You become an icon of purity, but only as long as you stay behind the gate. Step outside and suddenly your vow of virginity becomes suspect. The world believes in your sanctity only if you remain out of sight. That suspicion follows you even inside. If you're too pretty, too charismatic, too outspoken, rumours start. Maybe you're hiding something. Maybe you're possessed. Maybe you've got a secret lover. And if a nun becomes pregnant, it's a scandal so big it could bring down the whole convent. Historians still puzzle over these rare but explosive incidents. Some blame wandering monks or corrupt confessors, some blame the women, but most agree it was always the nun who paid the price, and yet the convent could also be a place of quiet resistance. Away from the gaze of husbands and fathers, some women thrive. They write poetry about love, not always spiritual. They document dreams, record visions, experiment with healing. Some grow old without ever being touched by a man. Some die content buried beneath stone with the Latin carved above them. Others die angry or regretful or forgotten. The convent becomes what you make it. If you are devout, it becomes holy. If you are desperate, it becomes refuge. If you're clever, it becomes a mask. But it is never neutral. Your body is still watched, judged, measured by how well you deny it. Tonight, as the light fades from your room and the world outside your window quiets, imagine lying on a narrow cot in a cold stone cell, hands clasped under your chin, reciting the same prayer you've said every night for 20 years. And ask yourself, is this peace, or is this just the most polite version of control? Sleep on it. You wake to the sound of bells and the chatter of the market, and for the first time in a while, you're not giving birth, joining a convent, or facing accusations of witchcraft. You're just walking through the village square trying to breathe without attracting too much attention. But even here in the open air, your body is a problem. Or rather, it's a spectacle. Because in the medieval world, what you wear isn't just fashion, it's law. And those laws, they're written almost entirely by men. They're called sumptuary laws, and they exist to tell people, especially women, exactly what they can and can't wear based on class, wealth, morality and marital status. And you're not exempt. No one is. If you're a married woman, you're expected to cover your hair. If you're unmarried but of noble birth, you're allowed certain fabrics but not others. If you're poor, you can forget about silk or fur or even too many layers. And if you're seen wearing something that doesn't match your station, your morality, or your husband's social ambitions, you're in violation. These laws are everywhere. England, France, the Italian city-states, they all had their versions. They might dictate the number of rings you can wear, the kind of embroidery on your sleeves, how many pearls are too many pearls, or even the width of your belt. Yes, the width. Because apparently your belt said a lot about your morals. And then there's colour. Red might be banned for you but reserved for courtesans or noblewomen. Purple might be off limits unless you're royalty. Gold thread, forbidden to all but the elite. It's less about preventing extravagance and more about making sure everyone knows their place. It's social control stitched right into your hemline. And who enforces these laws? Men, of course, magistrates, clerics, husbands, fathers. They might fine you, shame you, or even force you to change clothes in public if they think you've overstepped. Imagine being dragged into a town square and forced to strip off a cloak or have your veil cut in half because someone decided you looked too expensive. Now, imagine how many men actually got punished for their clothing violations. Spoiler alert, fewer. But it's not just about wealth, it's about visibility. A woman who dresses too finely might be accused of vanity or seduction. A woman who dresses too plainly might be accused of laziness or rebellion. Your appearance becomes a public commentary. You're not just walking through the square, you're making a statement whether you want to or not. And those statements are read by everyone, especially men. Even fashion accessories get political. Veils, for instance, are loaded symbols. In many towns, married women are required actually, to wear a veil in public, not for style, but for modesty. To go unveiled as a married woman? That's scandalous. It implies availability, or arrogance, or even prostitution, depending on who's looking. Some towns had fines for women caught outdoors without the proper head covering, especially if they were of respectable status. Others enforced specific colours or cloth types for widows, brides or servants. One wrong veil and you've just committed a moral crime. And if you think this only applies to noble women in courtly gowns, think again. Even peasants had standards to follow. You could be fined for wearing a belt too ornate for your class, or for wearing shoes that curled too far upward at the toe. Yes, shoe laws were real. In fact, the length of the shoe tip often indicated your status. The longer and pointier the shoe, the richer or more arrogant you were assumed to be. So of course women had shorter ones, more practical, less threatening, less noticeable. Some of this sounds ridiculous now, and it was, but it also reveals something deeply sinister. That the female body was considered so disruptive, so volatile, that it had to be literally wrapped in control. If they couldn't control your thoughts, your womb, or your desires, they could at least regulate your shoes, your sleeves, and your neckline. And here's a strange twist. In some places, prostitutes were required to wear specific clothing, bright ribbons, striped cloaks, certain colours, to mark them publicly. At first glance, this seems like punishment, but here's the irony. These women often had more freedom to dress boldly than so-called respectable women. They weren't pretending to be modest, so they got to claim visibility in ways wives and daughters never could. Some leaned into it, wore the brightest colours they could, turned their punishment into a kind of brand. And don't forget the role of hair. In the medieval imagination, a woman's uncovered hair was basically a flashing neon sign. It symbolised youth, seduction, and sometimes sin. So married women had to keep it covered, tightly, neatly, always. There were specific types of headdresses for each stage of life. If you went around with your hair flowing loose as an adult woman, people assumed one of two things. Either you were unmarried and stupid, or you were trying to attract the wrong kind of attention. This obsession bled into art. Paintings of saints always show women with tightly braided, heavily covered hair, unless they're martyrs being stripped and humiliated. Then the hair flows dramatically, wild and shamed. It's a visual cue, modesty as control, letting your hair down. That's for sinners or corpses. And yet some women pushed back, not always loudly but in small clever ways. A rebellious choice of fabric, a veil a little too sheer, a shoe just a bit too pointed. Fashion became a quiet form of protest. You couldn't say what you thought, but you could wear it. Sometimes just enough to get noticed, sometimes just enough to get away with it. Still, the consequences were real. Public shaming, fines, exclusion from church. In some cases, accusations of witchcraft or lewdness followed the wrong outfit. If a woman looked too good at the wrong moment, she could be blamed for inciting sin, even blamed for her own assault, as if her sleeve length made someone else's crime inevitable. Scholars still debate whether these laws were consistently enforced or just symbolic. Some say they were more about moral signalling than daily policing. Others argue they were brutally enforced in certain cities and mostly ignored in others. But the message was clear across the board. Your body must remain legible, predictable, modest, controlled. So tonight, as you curl under your blanket, think of standing in a cold stone street with fabric clinging to your shoulders, knowing that every thread you wear is speaking for you, that even in silence your body is shouting, and the world is always listening. There's a chill in the air, not because of the season, but because everyone in the village has suddenly gone quiet. You're not sure why at first, until you see her. She's being dragged through the square on the back of a donkey, barefoot, her dress torn, her hair chopped unevenly like a punishment not even worth finishing. The crowd isn't laughing. They're watching, judging, absorbing the spectacle like it's part of the calendar. This is what they do when a woman steps out of line. Welcome to the public shaming ritual, the medieval equivalent of cancel culture, except with livestock and spit. You've heard the stories, maybe even seen it before. A woman accused of adultery, or maybe just caught in the wrong room at the wrong time. She might be a scold, a term for a woman who talks too much or too loudly or too intelligently. She might have ignored a summons. She might have looked at someone the wrong way. Doesn't really matter. What matters is that the village needs to see her punished, and more importantly, needs you to see her punished. Punishment is theatre in the Middle Ages. It's not enough to lock someone away or fine them. That's too private, too quiet. When a woman defies the role she's been boxed into, her correction needs to be loud, visual, humiliating. That's how you maintain control, by making the consequences visible. You don't just erase someone, you unwrite them in front of everyone. Riding backward on a donkey is one of the classics. The symbolism is clear. She's foolish, inverted, a disruption of order. Sometimes she's forced to hold a sign around her neck naming her crime. Sometimes she's paraded with kitchen tools hanging from her waist, reminders of what she should have been doing. Sometimes she's smeared with soot or garbage, and her hair, gone, shorn off like a condemned nun, a symbol of disgrace and lost virtue. Hair matters. It's one of the few things women have some control over, and the church made sure to link it to moral standing. Cutting it wasn't just cosmetic, it was a declaration. You strip a woman's hair, you strip her identity. That's why so many shaming rituals begin with scissors. One snip and she's less than a woman in the eyes of the crowd. Just a body to be looked at. A warning sign on 2 legs, and there's more. The cucking stool, a chair used to dunk women into water, usually for being quarrelsome or suspected of adultery. In some villages, it's called the scold's bridle, though that name is better suited for an even worse punishment, a metal muzzle locked around the mouth, with a spike pressing down on the tongue, designed for women who talk too much. You can't even scream in that thing, you just drip and sob and try not to choke while the town laughs or prays or scowls depending on the mood. Then there's the pillory. You're forced to stand in a wooden frame, wrists and head locked in place on display. People throw rotten food, mud, dung. Some shout, others spit. Sometimes the crowd is half drunk and half angry and wholly unpredictable. You're stuck there until someone decides your penance is enough, or until your knees give out, whichever comes first. What's disturbing is how gendered all of this is. Men get punished too, sure, but the methods for women almost always target the body in symbolic ways. Public nudity, shaving, binding the mouth, these aren't random choices. They're ways to strip a woman of her social identity, to remind everyone watching that her worth depends on modesty, obedience, and chickens. Step outside those and you become a thing, a lesson. Sometimes shaming rituals are sanctioned by the church. Other times they're community-driven, folk punishments passed down like family recipes. In either case, they serve the same function. Reassert control, remind everyone where the lines are, remind you what happens if you cross them. And because these rituals are public, they rely on the crowd, on complicity, on everyone watching, even if they don't approve, even if they whisper later that it was too much. The spectacle needs spectators. And here's the strange part. Sometimes the woman being punished plays along. She doesn't resist. Maybe she's too shocked. Maybe she knows that fighting back only makes it worse. Or maybe, in a twisted way, she's reclaiming the narrative. By surviving the shame, by walking through it upright, she defies its intent. She refuses to break. But not always. Sometimes the shame works exactly as designed. You return home shorn and silent, eyes down, hands trembling. You become a ghost in your own life, a woman who once was. You're not jailed, but you're not free either. People remember, even years later, and the memory sticks to you like smoke. One of the more fringe punishments, so bizarre you almost have to laugh to keep from wincing, involves symbolic animals. Women were sometimes paraded with fake tails attached, likening them to animals in heat. Literal tail shaming. It's both absurd and cruel, and deeply revealing. Because underneath all the chants and rituals, what's really being punished is desire. Not just sexual, but social. You wanted something outside the bounds. Respect, independence, pleasure, justice. And now the world wants to drag you back by your hair. Or what's left of it. Scholars still argue about how widespread these practices were, and whether they were reserved for extreme cases or used more casually. Some say they were rare, but theatrical, meant to create long-lasting impressions. Others point to local records showing regular incidents. Either way, the message is clear. The community has the right to police your body, and the more visible you are, the more dangerous you become. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, try to imagine what it feels like to walk barefoot on cobblestones, while dozens of eyes burn holes in your back. Try to imagine the silence that follows, the quiet after everyone has turned away, convinced they've done the right thing. And you just keep walking, because what else is there to do? You weren't the first, and you won't be the last. You hear it in the whispers first. 2 girls behind the bread stall murmuring about a charm they heard can make someone fall in love. A bundle of herbs tucked under the pillow, a ribbon soaked in wine and knotted with hair. You smile because you know the stories. You've even tried one once, when you were 15 and hopelessly smitten with the blacksmith's apprentice. It didn't work, of course. He barely noticed you, and you were too afraid to push the spell further. Because in your world, love isn't just a feeling, no. It's a transaction, a sin, a strategy, and sometimes, if you're desperate enough, a weapon. Love potions are more than superstition. They're a response to a society that gives women no real agency over desire. You're not supposed to choose who you love, you're told who to marry. Your job is to submit, not to long, so if you fall in love, or want someone, or want to be wanted, there are few paths left to take. Magic is one of them. In medieval Europe, the line between healing and seduction is thin. The same woman who brews a tea for your cramps might also sell you a charm to keep your husband faithful, or one to make someone fall into bed with you. These women live on the edges of villages and social order, not quite witches, not quite saints, just useful. People visit them in secret, and then deny it in daylight. The most common ingredients in love potions: herbs like mandrake, yarrow, myrtle, and sometimes even animal parts. Some mixtures are harmless, others could knock you out or cause hallucinations. Some include bodily fluids, blood, spit, even menstrual blood. Yes, you heard that right. The theory goes that the more of you there is in the potion, the stronger the effect. The more personal, the more powerful. Disturbing, maybe, but also telling. Because in a world where you have no control, putting your literal essence into something starts to feel like the only power you have left. And here's where things get morally murky. These potions aren't always about romance. Sometimes they're used for coercion. Sometimes to bind a reluctant husband. Sometimes to manipulate an encounter that would never happen otherwise. It's the flip side of powerlessness. When no one gives you consent, you stop asking for theirs. And while some women brew these potions with hope, others use them with bitterness. Because when love is impossible, manipulation starts to look a lot like survival. Men use them too, of course, especially men who want access to women who would never look their way. They call it seduction. But it's often just another word for assault, glossed over with herbs and prayers. In taverns and alleyways, love potions become date-rape drugs by another name. Only there's no modern outrage, no consent discourse, just silence, or laughter, or accusations, almost always against the woman, no matter who brewed the potion. And the church. The church loathes all of it. Love potions are considered a form of sorcery, an affront to divine will. Because love, in the eyes of doctrine, is supposed to be pure, rational, and controlled by God, not hormones, not herbs, not desperate teenage girls. Using a love charm is not just a sin, it's a threat to the moral order, because it suggests that you want love outside the structure they gave you, that you want affection that's not approved. Some women were punished for this, not with fire usually, but with confession, penance, and social exile. You might be told to fast for weeks, or sent to work in a convent garden, or forbidden from attending mass. You might be shamed in public, your name whispered in church as an example of lust unchecked. But more often than not, you're just made into a warning. Someone other girls learn not to imitate, out loud anyway. Yet the practice never stops, because the need never stops. In a world where marriage is arranged and love is secondary, people crave shortcuts to closeness. Spells, herbs, charms, they become the language of the heart that no one else allows you to speak. Even in courtly circles, love magic has its place. Poets write of enchanted rings, of sighs turned to spells, of amulets that awaken passion. The noble version is wrapped in metaphors. The peasant version gets you excommunicated. But they're two sides of the same coin. Whether you're a bored noblewoman hoping to make your nightfall harder, or a servant girl trying to keep your betrothed from wandering, you're both reaching for something you're not allowed to claim. Emotional agency. Desire, when you act on it, becomes rebellion. And here's a quirky historical nugget. In some love trials, the men involved actually argued that they were victims of magic, that they wouldn't have committed adultery or dishonoured themselves if the woman hadn't enchanted them. And sometimes it worked. The woman was punished. He walked free, because in a society obsessed with purity, it's always easier to blame the spell than the feelings it uncovered. Scholars still debate how seriously these potions were taken. Were they actual attempts at magic, or just folk medicine tangled up in hope? Some say the belief itself was the point, that if you truly believed someone loved you, the potion worked. Others think it was mostly placebo, emotional performance wrapped in ritual. But whether or not the magic was real, the danger was. If someone found the wrong pouch of herbs in your room, if your secret was overheard, if someone got sick after kissing you, it could spiral fast. And still, people kept trying. Because love, especially forbidden, impossible love, is one of the few things that makes life bearable when everything else is decided for you. Love potions, as ridiculous or dangerous as they seem now, were never really about magic. They were about longing, about trying to bend the rules when you don't get to write them. So tonight, as the night air presses against your window and your heart starts to slow, think of all the girls who tied knots in ribbons, whispered names into the wind, and slipped tiny vials under their pillows, not to deceive but to dream. Because sometimes the only way to love in a world built on control is to reach for a little magic, even if it burns you. You're perched on the edge of a velvet-cushioned bench, staring out a narrow castle window. Somewhere in the courtyard below, a knight is practicing his lance technique. The sun catches his armour in brilliant, blinding flashes. He looks noble, powerful, heroic, like something out of a song, and that's exactly the problem, because the songs are everywhere. In your books, your prayers, your bedtime stories. The knight and the maiden, the rescue, the vow, the sword raised in your name. It's a fantasy you've been fed since you could walk, and it's also a trap. Welcome to the Chivalric Code, the medieval rulebook that's less about honour and more about how to romanticize controlling women. The maiden-knight dynamic is the glittering jewel of this fantasy. You, pale and gentle, need protection. He, bold and brave, is the protector, and everyone knows what happens next. He slays a dragon, or wins a duel, or survives a holy quest, and then he gets you. Maybe not in body if you're pure, but in admiration, obedience, gratitude. Either way, you're the prize, and you're not supposed to mind. At first glance, it sounds flattering. A man fights for your honour, writes poems about your eyes, offers his life in exchange for your favour. Not bad, right? But dig deeper, and the whole thing starts to feel like a game where you're the trophy, not the player. Your virtue is his badge of glory, your name, untouched, angelic, is the banner he carries into battle. You're not supposed to want anything. You're supposed to inspire him to want more, to be better, which is poetic, yes, but also completely one-sided. Chivalry, for all its polished armour and courtly manners, was a masculine performance built on a fantasy of women as passive symbols. The ideal lady was beautiful, silent, modest, and perpetually in need of guidance. She sits in towers. She drops handkerchiefs. She prays for her knight's return. But she does not speak out of turn. She does not lead. And she definitely doesn't get to choose her own knight. That part is almost always arranged. And don't forget, most of this idealised behaviour applied only to noblewomen. Peasant girls weren't part of the chivalric imagination. No one wrote ballads about farmhands. The entire concept is soaked in classism. Only women who could be placed on pedestals were worthy of this so-called protection. Everyone else just had to hope they weren't in the way when the sword started swinging. But even noble women found themselves trapped. The same man who bows before you in court might demand total obedience at home. Because chivalry wasn't legally binding, it was aspirational, a fantasy. Real knights broke vows, assaulted women, started wars, ignored boundaries. And yet, as long as they maintained the performance, wrote the letters, kissed the ring, spoke the poetry, they were praised. You had to remain a virgin, loyal, morally spotless. If the story fell apart, everyone blamed the maiden. You see this double standard everywhere. In the poems of troubadours, the lady is adored from afar but never heard. Her voice is filtered through the male poet's longing. Her thoughts, irrelevant. Her feelings, optional. All that matters is the effect she has on him. She is a mirror, not a person. And if she's bold, if she returns affection with confidence, that's dangerous for Hogges. Now she's no longer an inspiration, she's a temptation. The moment she stops playing the passive role, the narrative pivots. She becomes the seductress, the corrupter. Think of Guinevere in Arthurian legend. One minute she's the beautiful queen whose presence strengthens her king. The next, she's the unfaithful wife whose desires bring down Camelot. Women in these stories are either damsels or disasters. There's rarely a middle ground. Here's a fringe detail that doesn't make it into the bedtime version. Many of these knightly rescues were less about heroism and more about property retrieval. If a noblewoman was abducted or ran off, her male relatives would send a knight to retrieve her not just out of love, but because her absence threatened inheritance lines, dowry claims, and political alliances. The lady's body once again stood in for something else. Territory, wealth, honour. Her actual feelings, not the point. And yet some women played the game to their advantage. Clever noblewomen learned to use the chivalric script to manipulate their social standing. They wrote letters that hinted at affection while maintaining plausible deniability. They posed as distant, virtuous figures, understanding that little mystery gave them more power than honesty ever could. One woman's cold indifference was another strategy for avoiding a forced marriage. You even had some female authors poking holes in the script. Christine de Pizan, a 14th century writer and one of the earliest known female professional authors, openly criticised the way chivalric literature turned women into passive objects. She argued that women should be celebrated for wisdom and courage, not just for how well they looked in silk and sorrow. And while her ideas were radical for her time, they caught on with other women living under the weight of romance gone toxic. But the fantasy never died. It just got prettier. Castles, dragons, noble quests, pining love songs. It's seductive stuff. It still is. Even today we inherit the same tired tropes. The girl waiting to be saved. The man proving his worth through violence or sacrifice. It's everywhere from Disney to dating apps. So as you lie back tonight, maybe with one arm behind your head and that fan humming softly in the background, ask yourself what kind of story you'd want to live in. One where you wait in a tower, or one where you burn the tower down? Because you don't need a knight to rescue you, you need the sword. There's parchment on the table and wax on the floor. A scribe somewhere in a warm corner of a lord's manor is drawing up a contract. Not a treaty, not a land deed, but something far more intimate, a marriage agreement. Only to him it's not intimate at all. It's property management. And you're the property. In the medieval world, marriage isn't about love, that much you already know, but what often gets overlooked is just how legally binding it is. On you. When you marry, you're not just saying yes to a man, you're transferring ownership of your body, your labour, and your legal identity into his hands. You become part of his estate, subject to his rule. This isn't poetic, it's the law. Under most systems of medieval legal thought, Roman, canon, or feudal, marriage turns a woman into something called a feme covert. That means your legal identity is literally covered by your husband's. You can't own property in your own name, you can't sign contracts, you can't sue or be sued independently. If your husband commits a crime and you were with him, it's assumed you were either helping or too dumb to stop him. Both interpretations work against you. Your consent matters only briefly at the altar when you say yes. After that it's assumed, especially when it comes to your body. The husband's conjugal rights are not romantic, and they're certainly not optional. If he demands sex, you're expected to comply. Refusal can be grounds for punishment, even annulment. And the Church, for all its preaching about purity and restraint, it actually codifies these rights. Canon law makes it clear. Both spouses owe each other the marriage debt, which sounds more like a loan default than intimacy. But in practice it favours men. Women who say no are seen as disobedient. Men who say no, that's a spiritual failing, not a legal one. And there's the elephant in the room. Marital rape wasn't considered a crime. Not by the law, not by the Church. Once you're married, your body is assumed to be in a constant state of availability. You can be beaten for disobedience, locked away for infidelity, humiliated for failing to conceive, all within the bounds of marital rights. Your pain becomes part of the furniture. There's a chilling piece of canon law from Gratian's Decretum, a foundational 12th century legal text. It describes how a woman, once married, owes obedience to her husband the way a servant does to a lord. Not out of cruelty, mind you, out of divine order. This isn't about power, it's about God's plan. Neat trick, huh? And it doesn't stop with your body. Your children belong to your husband. If you separate or he dies, the guardianship of your children often goes to his male relatives. You might raise them if they allow it, but you have no legal claim. In some regions, widows even have to pay to keep custody. It's not just your womb that's policed, it's everything that comes out of it. Still, you're expected to smile, to be gracious, to perform the role of good wife like it's a religious vocation. You're praised for being patient, gentle, and forgiving, even when forgiveness is the last thing you have left. Literature from the time gushes about the virtues of quiet women. One popular manual compares a good wife to a well-tuned harp, beautiful, obedient, and silent unless touched by the right hands. And let's say your husband dies. You might think, finally some freedom, and you'd be partly right. Widows had more legal autonomy than married women. You could inherit land, run a household, even conduct business, but you'd still be pressured to remarry, especially if you were young and fertile. Your womb, remember, is still valuable, and while widows are often depicted as wise and respectable, they're also seen as suspicious. too independent, too wealthy, too free. Here's a strange detail. Some women faked madness to avoid marriage. Others ran away to convents not for God, but for a locked door and a lifetime of not having to belong to someone. In rare cases, women petitioned the church for annulment, not because they didn't love their husbands, but because they never gave proper consent. Some cases were successful, most weren't. After all, consent is a slippery thing when your family signs it on your behalf at age 12. The law doesn't always need violence to control you. Sometimes it just needs paperwork, contracts, customs, social pressure. You're taught that your purpose is to marry, that your worth lies in being wanted. So when the law says you now belong to someone else, you're supposed to feel honoured, blessed, elevated. But what you actually feel is erased. There were exceptions, of course. Powerful noble women who managed estates, acted as regents, even fought legal battles. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Matilda of Tuscany. They bent the system to their will, but they were the outliers. The rule was silence, obedience, disappearance, and scholars still argue about how much say women had in all this. Some believe the marriage laws were softened by local custom, mothers whispering advice, aunts helping negotiate kinder matches. Others argue it was stricter than we realise, especially in rural areas where traditions were enforced more rigidly. The truth probably lies in the grey space between, a world where small resistances flickered beneath a mountain of control. Tonight, as your body sinks into the mattress and the room settles into shadow, imagine signing away your voice. Imagine giving everything to someone who sees you not as a person, but as a piece of the estate. And then imagine smiling, like they taught you to do, because what other choice do you have? Sleep property. It's late, and the streets are dim, the tavern's starting to quiet, the priests long since tucked into their vespers. But there's one type of woman still working. Not behind a loom, not in a kitchen, on the corner, in a doorway, draped in fabrics that flicker in firelight, face painted, posture open because it has to be. She's a prostitute. And in the medieval world, she's both a necessity and a sin. Welcome to the strangest corner of medieval womanhood. Reviled, required, and very rarely respected. You wouldn't think this job would have a place in a society so obsessed with purity. But here's the contradiction. Prostitution was everywhere, in big cities and sleepy towns, near ports, near universities, even near monasteries. And while the church officially condemned it, called it immoral, a danger to the soul, an invitation to hell, it also tolerated it, regulated it, even in some places taxed it, because the same men preaching chastity on Sundays were creating the demand every other night of the week. The logic was twisted but consistent. Men were weak. Their desire had to go somewhere, and better it go to a woman already fallen than risk corrupting a virgin or a respectable wife. It was considered a lesser evil. One church official even described prostitutes as the sewers of the city, gross, yes, but necessary to keep the rest of society clean. That's the role you're given. Human filtration system for male desire. Of course, the prostitutes themselves didn't get a say in that metaphor. You might be there by choice or not. Poverty pushed many women into the trade. Abandoned widows, orphans, women who'd lost dowries in fires or floods or bad luck. Some were sold by desperate families. Others were trafficked across borders. A few, believe it or not, entered voluntarily. Not because it was easy, but because it was better than starving. Because they could make their own money. Because in a world that owned their bodies anyway, they figured they might as well get paid for it. And pay it did. In prosperous towns, some prostitutes earned decent money. Enough to rent a room, feed themselves, even buy finer clothes than proper women could afford. That's part of what made them so threatening. A woman who made money from her body was seen as dangerous, independent, outside the system. So cities did everything they could to control them. Some places established red light districts, literal streets of sin. In Venice it was the Carampan, in Paris the Rue Gravois, in London Southwark. These areas were tolerated but tightly regulated. Brothels were licensed, watched, sometimes run by local authorities. The women were often required to register, pay fees, wear certain clothing, like yellow veils or striped gowns to mark them as fallen. Think of it like a uniform but humiliating. And if you broke the rules, the punishments were creative. Fines, public shaming, forced haircuts, flogging, sometimes all of the above, because as much as men relied on sex work, they also needed to visibly condemn it, to prove they weren't approving it. That's how the hypocrisy stayed intact. But the worst wasn't the public punishment, it was the moral isolation. You're barred from church, from marriage, from the marketplace in some towns. You can't own property in others. Your children, if you have them, carry your stain. You become the living embodiment of sin, not because you're evil, but because you're useful. And yet you exist in a strange space. You know things most women don't. You know about male desire, not the holy version, not the sanitized version, the real thing. You know how it works, how to navigate it, how to manipulate it if you have to. You hear confessions in the dark. You see the town's most respected men reduced to stammering boys. You see priests, merchants, nobles. Everyone comes to you eventually. You become a shadow therapist, a secret keeper, a fantasy in flesh. And sometimes, despite all odds, you carve out a strange kind of community. Some brothels are run by older women who look after their girls like a mother hen, strict but protective. There are rules, no violence, no drunken clients, no theft. Some women develop friendships here they never found at home. They eat together, pray together even, in whispered Latin, on cold floors, hoping that God sees past their labels. Still, you're never safe. You can be attacked, robbed, murdered, and the law won't rush to help. If you're raped, it's not considered rape. You're already fallen, they say. As if consent becomes irrelevant once you've sold it once. As if your body becomes a public object stripped of autonomy by the act of survival. There's one haunting detail that sticks with you. In some cities, brothels were built near hospitals. Why? Because sick men were considered less dangerous. Or because women, once sick themselves, often with untreated infections, were sent directly across the street. It was efficient. Horrifyingly efficient. But then there were places where the profession was elevated, briefly, strangely. In some parts of Renaissance Italy, courtesans were considered cultured, educated companions. They read poetry, debated philosophy, played instruments. They were lovers and muses to powerful men. Think Veronica Franco in Venice, poet, provocateur, legend. But even those women walked a knife's edge. Their fame made them targets. Their intellect made them dangerous. One wrong rumour and they were back in the gutter, or on trial for witchcraft. Historians still argue about how much agency medieval sex workers actually had. Were they victim? Survivors? Entrepreneurs? Probably all three, depending on the day. What's certain is that they lived in constant contradiction. Worshipped in the dark, shamed in daylight, needed and never respected. And so tonight, as the streets outside your window empty and your pillow welcomes the weight of your head, think of a woman slipping out of a doorway, coins clinking in a pouch at her waist. She's tired but standing, judged but still here. And in a world that insists on owning your body, maybe survival is its own kind of defiance. Sleep gently, sinner and saint. Morning light filters through stained glass, casting delicate reds and golds onto the stone floor. You're in church again, kneeling among dozens of other women, head bowed. But your eyes flicker up, not toward the altar, not toward the priest, but toward the statue in the niche above him. There she is, tall, serene, and radiant, the Virgin Mary. Her arms open, her head bowed in quiet majesty. No blood, no bruises, no children clinging to her skirts. Just holiness in a blue robe. This is what you're told to be. Always. A mother, but a virgin. A woman, but not of the world. Desired, but never desiring. It's impossible. The cult of the Virgin Mary blooms in the medieval period like a garden of contradictions. She becomes not just a religious figure, but the model of ideal womanhood. She's everything you're supposed to be, and everything you'll never manage to become. Pure, obedient, gentle, silent. She's motherhood without mess, pregnancy without sex, suffering without bitterness. She's not just your spiritual guide, she's the impossible measuring stick pressed against every part of your life. And here's the real kicker. While Mary is glorified, actual mothers are policed, scorned, even punished for their bodies. You bleed during childbirth. That's a sin-stained process. You struggle with lust. That's Eve rearing her ugly head again. But Mary makes motherhood look divine, untouched. She's never caught crying in the middle of the night, never cursed by a bad husband, never bruised by childbirth. Her labour is silent. Her child is perfect, Her sacrifice is revered, but abstract. And yet medieval women love her, genuinely, desperately, because even though she's out of reach, she's also the only feminine divine figure they're allowed to connect with. You can't pray to God as a woman and expect comfort. But Mary, she might understand. You beg her for fertility, for safe childbirth, for protection. You place candles before her image. You whisper prayers into folded hands, hoping she'll soften the punishments men have justified with scripture. She becomes a sacred loophole. When no one else will listen to your pain, you turn to the woman in blue. And if you're lucky, sometimes you feel heard. But this adoration has strings attached. The Church uses Mary as a behavioural template. Want to be holy? Be like her. Be modest. Be self-sacrificing. Be chaste. That's the model. Anything else, a woman who speaks up, seeks pleasure, owns land, refuses a man, that's a deviation. That's not divine. That's disorder. This creates a cruel binary. You can be Mary, or you can be Eve. There's no in-between. And since no living woman can actually be Mary, virgin and mother, selfless and powerful, eternally serene, you're always falling short. Always closest to Eve than you'd like to admit. The Virgin becomes not just an ideal, but a weapon. A constant reminder of your own unworthiness. You see it everywhere. In sermons, in stained glass, in pageants and plays. Mary hovers over your life like a holy shadow. In childbirth, she's there. In your wedding vows, her name is invoked. Even in death, she's supposed to welcome you if you've been pure enough. She's the patroness of women, and yet she never lived your life. Never worked in the fields, never buried a stillborn, never took a beating for speaking out of turn. She's both your refuge and your rebuke. And the art? Oh, the art. Mary is painted more than any other woman in history. She's shown nursing the Christ child, her breast exposed but somehow still chaste. She's crowned in gold, her eyes downcast. She's floating, elevated, untouched by gravity or grief. Meanwhile, images of real women, especially women accused of sin, are raw, harsh, full of punishment and pain. Compare Mary to Mary Magdalene. One is light, the other shadow. One is grace, the other guilt. The message is crystal clear, be one or be damned. Still, some women try to bridge the gap. They become nuns, devoting their lives to imitating the Virgin. Some mystics even claim spiritual marriages to Christ, casting themselves as mini-Marys. They embrace chastity, obedience, and suffering. And occasionally their visions gain traction. They write about being filled with divine love, or pierced by holy desire. These writings are both beautiful and disturbing. You can't help but notice how often they describe pain in sensual terms. Holiness starts to sound like arousal. It's a reminder that even when women try to be purely spiritual, the body, the messy human female body, always bleeds through. And here's a strange little detail. Some medieval theologians argued over whether Mary even gave birth in the usual way. There were long debates about whether Christ passed through her womb like light through glass. Why? Because admitting that the Virgin bled or suffered during labour would make her too human, too real. And if she was real, she wasn't perfect. And if she wasn't perfect, then the whole model falls apart. So they decided she didn't bleed. She didn't tear, she didn't scream. She just delivered a saviour like it was a sunrise. Quiet, radiant, painless. And you, standing with blood between your thighs, weeping over another miscarriage, or hating your body for its cravings, are left with the aftermath. A standard that demands the impossible, and a faith that punishes the real. Some women quietly start to push back. They paint Mary holding herbs or healing the sick. They write poems that focus on her strength, not her purity. They talk to her like a sister, not a goddess. And through these little acts, they start to remake her in their own image. Still sacred, but also earthly. The Mary who understands pain, not just perfection. Still, the official version remains, and you're left chasing it like a ghost. Trying to be pure but fertile, silent but strong, obedient but useful. A mother with no stain, a woman with no want. A body that serves without ever being its own. So tonight, as you lie in the dark, whisper your prayer not to the men who wrote the rules, but to the woman in blue. Ask her what it feels like to be adored by everyone, but understood by no one. And then, close your eyes, because even saints get tired. It starts with a glance, nothing serious. Just a man eyeing you from across the marketplace while you haggle for onions, but his look lingers, too long. and suddenly the air around you shifts. It's not a compliment, it's a test. If you meet his eyes, you're inviting sin. If you don't, you're rude or haughty. Either way, your body is now the focus of a moral performance that has absolutely nothing to do with you. Because in the medieval world, a woman's desire isn't just taboo, it's dangerous. And even worse, a woman who awakens desire in men is blamed for their downfall. You're used to the warnings by now. They're in every sermon, every story. Guard your gaze. Do not tempt your brothers. A woman's beauty is the devil's trap. You're told that your very existence causes others to sin, and that your virtue is measured not by what you do, but by what you cause. If someone desires you, that's your fault. If someone sins because of you, that's on you too. And it's not just about lust, it's about power. Because when a woman expresses desire, when she wants something or someone or shows even the smallest hint of pleasure, she disrupts the entire structure. You weren't made to want, you were made to be wanted. That's the script. And any deviation, that's rebellion. Which makes you not just immoral, but unstable, untrustworthy, possibly possessed. It sounds dramatic, but it's everywhere. In literature, the women who desire always bring ruin. Think of Helen of Troy. Her face launched ships, and somehow that's her crime. Think of Guinevere, who dares to love Lancelot and is blamed for the collapse of a kingdom. Think of Eve. Always Eve, reaching, tasting, ruining it for everyone. Medieval thinkers didn't invent this trope. They inherited it, sure, but boy did they double down on it. There's even theology to back it up. Church fathers like Jerome and Augustine wrote endless treatises, warning men against the dangers of female flesh. Women, they said, were naturally more carnal, more tempting, more suspicious. The idea was that men sin, yes, but only because women invite them to. In this worldview, your body isn't a body. It's a weapon, and it doesn't matter what you think or feel. All that matters is what someone else sees in you. So what happens when you feel desire? Simple. You hide it. You learn to swallow it, to suffocate it before it can be noticed. You walk with your eyes down, cover your hair, speak softly. You pray when your body pulses at night, asking God to cleanse your dreams. You learn to fear yourself. And if you don't, if you act on it, even in the smallest way, you become a story, a warning. The girl who danced too freely, the wife who looked too long at the wrong man, the widow who remarried too soon. Every woman who stepped outside the narrow margins of holy femininity is transformed into folklore, into shame. Even the most innocent pleasure becomes suspect. Do you laugh too loudly at a man's joke? Do you enjoy dancing? Do you ask for a song to be repeated because you like how it makes you feel? It doesn't take much. You start to perform chastity not just with your body, but with your whole personality. You censor your joy, your curiosity, your appetite, because in this world, a hungry woman, any kind of hunger, is a threat. And here's a bizarre little historical gem. Some medieval men believed women had insatiable sexual appetites. That's right, the same women they silenced and shamed were also feared as walking furnaces of lust. There's even a belief that a woman's womb could itch for seed, and if left unsatisfied, it would wander. Yes, again with the wandering womb. So in one breath women are frigid, modest, pious, and in the next they're sex-obsessed and manipulative. Basically, no matter what you do, you're too much. And if you're too desirable, you must be using magic. That's how the logic works. Beauty becomes a form of suspicion. A lovely voice, a graceful body, these aren't just gifts. They're signs of supernatural influence. Maybe you've ensnared someone. Maybe you've cursed them. Maybe you're a temptress in league with the devil. Never mind that the same men accusing you were the ones writing courtly poems about fair maidens just last week. Even women's clothing is politicized. A bright dress, a hint of uncovered hair, a neckline that reveals a little too much. That's not fashion, it's provocation. If something happens to you, it's because you invited it. This is the original version of victim blaming, sewn into law, liturgy, and legend. And yet, desire persists. You fall in love, you fantasize, you dream of kissing someone not because you were told to, but because you want to. And that simple fact that you want is both exhilarating and terrifying, because it means your body belongs to you, not just to God, your father, your husband, or the law. Some women push back, quietly, secretly. They write poems about love, not always spiritual. They hide letters in hymns. They pass glances in church pews. A few even run off with lovers, abandoning their dowries and their reputations. Most are punished, of course, but some slip through the cracks, some find small happinesses between the rules, some find moments of joy that no priest or judge can take away. Historians debate how much space medieval women really had for desire. Some argue that the strictness was more theoretical than enforced, that everyday people were more pragmatic than their priests, that women found ways to live full, complex, emotional lives in spite of the rules. Others say the grip of the church was absolute, that shame soaked into every aspect of female experience. Maybe the truth lies somewhere in between, a patchwork of repression and resistance. Either way, the pattern is clear. Female desire had to be policed not because it was evil, but because it was powerful, because it refused to stay in the neat little box built for it, because it dared to want. So tonight, as your heart quiets and your limbs grow heavy beneath the blankets, think of a girl sitting in candlelight, quill in hand, writing a name she's not supposed to say out loud. Think of the risk she takes with every word. Think of the heat in her chest. Not sin, not shame, just want, and let that be enough. Because your desire was never the problem. Their fear of it was. You're not supposed to wait. That much has been drilled into you since birth. Women obey, women submit, women endure. That's the order of things. But the truth is, not every woman does. Some push back quietly, cleverly, or with blazing fury. You won't read their names in the official chronicles, carved into stone by men with careful hands, but they're there, between the lines, in court records, in folk songs, in the panic of those who tried and failed to keep them silent. These are the women who fought back against the control of their bodies, and they did it in ways big and small. Start with the simplest acts, refusal. A girl says no to an arranged marriage. Not dramatically, she just drags her feet, cries too loudly, pretends to be sick, runs away to a convent, fakes a vision. Not exactly a sword-swinging rebellion, but effective. If she's clever, she stalls long enough for the suitor to lose interest, or for her parents to reconsider, and at times that's all it takes. A well-timed stomachache, a divine dream, a sister who covers for her. In a world that offers you almost no control, even a delay is a victory. Then there are the women who push further, who speak up, who take their grievances to court, yes, actual court. Medieval Europe wasn't lawless. In fact, it was bogged down in endless rules and procedures, and sometimes women used those rules to their advantage. A wife accused of adultery might countersue for abuse. A midwife banned from practicing might argue that she saved more lives than the local priest. A widow might defend her right to her late husband's land, sometimes winning, sometimes not, but always refusing to fade. One of the most powerful tools a woman could wield? Words. In a world where her body was heavily policed, her voice became a weapon of its own. There are records of women composing ballads about their lives, lamenting injustices, or mocking the men who tried to control them. Some are anonymous, others survived under pseudonyms, but they're biting, bold, often funny in that way that barely hides a snarl. And then there are the riots. Yes, you heard that right. Women, peasants, fishwives, washerwomen starting riots. When food prices rose or wages were cut, women led protests in town squares, throwing rotten produce and insults with equal force. They stormed bakeries, they blocked tax collectors. In Paris, in London, in Florence, they made their presence known. Often dismissed as disorderly mobs, they were anything but. These were women defending their families, their survival, their dignity. Here's a lesser-known but fascinating case. In 14th century France, a woman named Jeanne de Clisson turned pirate after her husband was executed by the king. She sold her estate, bought ships, and launched a personal war on French nobility, targeting their vessels, executing prisoners, and becoming a legend known as the Lioness of Brittany. She wasn't fighting for ideology. She was fighting for revenge, for justice, for herself. And it wasn't always about violence or spectacle. Some women resisted through subversion. They used their roles, wife, mother, servant, as cover. They passed messages for rebel movements, smuggled banned texts, taught girls to read when no one was looking. One nun in a German abbey wrote letters to a male theologian challenging his interpretations of scripture, respectfully but firmly. She never left the convent, never raised a weapon, and yet her words travelled farther than most knights ever did. Of course, not all acts of resistance were noble or clean. Some women poisoned abusive husbands, others lied, blackmailed, seduced for power. This wasn't a fairy tale rebellion. It was messy, morally grey, often desperate. But that doesn't make it less real. When the system is rigged, even a dirty trick can be a kind of justice. And let's not forget the small rebellions. A woman who lets her hair down in public, a girl who wears a forbidden colour, a wife who refuses to kneel. These are moments so tiny they barely register in the official record, but they mattered. They were sparks, and sometimes sparks spread. Scholars still argue about how common this resistance really was. Some say it was rare, exceptional. Others argue it was constant, just hidden, unrecorded, dismissed. What we do know is this. Women found ways to survive, to bend the rules, to bite back when they could, and in doing so they carved out cracks in the walls built around them. Not enough to escape entirely, but enough to breathe. And those cracks, sometimes they grew, sometimes one woman's defiance inspired another's. A midwife tells her apprentice, "Don't let them scare you." A mother whispers to her daughter, "There's more than one way to live." Resistance, like faith, spreads in secret. So tonight, as the wind brushes your window and your bones settle into rest, think of the woman who stood up in the market and shouted when she wasn't supposed to. Think of the girl who ran, who wrote, who fought, who spat back at the world that told her to kneel. You don't know her name, but she made space for herself and maybe for you. Not every revolution wears armour. It begins, as these things often do, with a whisper, then a rumour, then a letter. The nuns are acting strange. Or maybe it's a girl who won't stop speaking in tongues, a woman who won't eat, a woman who won't stop eating, a woman who bleeds without a wound, who cries salt, who levitates, who prays until she collapses. By the time anyone tries to explain it, it's already too late. You're not dealing with ordinary piety anymore. You're standing in the presence of a female saint, or a lunatic, or something in between. The medieval world didn't really know what to do with women who actually claimed religious authority. Not the docile ones in wimples, murmuring psalms. Those were fine, predictable, contained. But the wild ones, the visionaries, the mystics, the ones who claimed God spoke to them personally and told them things no man wanted to hear, those women terrified everyone. And yet they existed, more than you'd think. In Italy there's Catherine of Siena, writing letters to popes and telling them off for cowardice. In Germany there's Hildegard of Bingen composing operas and describing visions in detailed colour-coded symphonies. In the Low Countries, a woman named Hadovich writes erotic poetry about union with God that makes even modern readers blush. These weren't quiet little nuns, they were forces of nature. And they had the nerve to believe that holiness didn't require male permission. Their bodies became the battleground. These women often experienced what today we might call psychosomatic symptoms, wounds that appeared without cause, fevers without heat, ecstasies so intense they collapsed from them. Catherine stopped eating altogether, claiming she was nourished only by the Eucharist. Her body withered to the point that she could barely stand, but her voice, loud as ever. Hildegard described migraines that came with divine visions, followed by months of writing that left her hands cramped and her lungs ragged. There. Suffering became their badge, proof that God had touched them, or depending on who you asked, proof that they'd gone mad. There's a strange freedom in being called insane. These women, so long as they wrapped their visions in religious language and balanced their ecstasies with obedience, at least in public, were sometimes allowed to be powerful. Not because men trusted them, but because their pain made them safe. You can't accuse a woman of pride when she's half-starved and covered in her own blood. And yet, some of them were proud of their divine connection, proud of their influence, proud of the way bishops and kings bent down to listen. And why shouldn't they be? They'd turned a rigged system inside out. In a world where women's voices were barely tolerated in their own homes, here were women dictating theology to the highest powers in Europe. Not because they were invited, but because they couldn't be ignored. Still, it was a dangerous tightrope. Mystics walked a line between sanctity and heresy. If your visions fit the Church's narrative, saint material. If they challenged authority, suddenly you're suspect. Several women who claimed divine visions were silenced, imprisoned, or burned. Joan of Arc, the teenage peasant girl who said saints spoke to her and told her to lead an army, was executed for heresy and cross-dressing. Later, they canonized her, but not before setting her on fire. And here's the complicated part. These women often reinforced the same system they subverted. They praised obedience, chastity, and spiritual suffering. They told other women to serve, to submit, to fast until their skin clung to their bones. But at the same time, their very existence challenged everything those teachings were supposed to uphold. Because deep down, their message wasn't just be holy, it was, God speaks to me, not to your husband, not to your priest, to me, and some women listened. You see little ripples. A girl in a small village begins to write her own prayers. A mother teaches her daughter how to meditate. Women start forming informal devotional circles outside the church's direct oversight. They read mystical texts, not just the Psalms. They copy letters, discuss symbols, create their own rituals. In Germany, the Beguines, a lay religious community, grows out of this energy. Independent, female-led, charitable, and slightly heretical. No vows, no husbands, just women living together, working, praying, and surviving outside the cloister. Not everyone is happy about this. Local authorities begin cracking down. Bishops declare unauthorized spiritual movements dangerous. Orders are given to dissolve communities, burn writings, silence the overly inspired. The same church that canonized mystic women turns on them when their holiness stops being useful. Power, especially female power, is only tolerated when it's safely framed. Strip the frame away, and suddenly your visions are dangerous. And yet the mystics endure. Their writings survive. Their influence lingers. Even centuries later, scholars read their words and marvel at the tension between obedience and rebellion, silence and voice, ecstasy and agony. They were caught in a system designed to erase them, and they made themselves unforgettable anyway. So what does it mean to be holy in a world that uses holiness to control you? What does it mean to embrace spiritual pain when your pain is already expected, even demanded? What does it mean to hear a voice that tells you you're more than just a womb or a warning sign? Tonight, as the room goes still and your breath grows soft, imagine yourself lying in a dark cell, your hands clasped over a chest too empty to feed you, your heart full of something you can't quite name. Maybe it's hunger, maybe it's grace, maybe it's rage that burns so clean it feels divine. Whatever it is, it's yours, and no one gets to rewrite it. Imagine stepping out into a crisp morning, pulling your cloak tightly around your shoulders, and no one notices you're not what they've been. Your hair is tucked beneath a cap, your chest bound, your gait deliberate. You pass by labourers and merchants and priests, and not one of them looks twice. To them, you're just another man, a novice monk, a messenger boy, a clerk in training. You've slipped the net of womanhood, at least for today. And in the medieval world, that's more than rebellion. It's survival. For most people back then, gender is destiny. It's written into the law, the scripture, the clothes you wear, the way you walk. And yet, scattered throughout history like footprints barely visible in the mud are people who lived outside those rigid lines. Some dressed differently. Some lived as another gender entirely. Some resisted definition altogether. And though medieval Europe didn't have the language we use today, no non-binary, no transgender, it certainly had people who defied the roles they were given. Start with the cross-dressers. That's the label historians like to use, though it doesn't come close to the complexity of what was actually happening. Sometimes it was about necessity. A woman wanted to travel alone or escape an abusive marriage, so she dressed as a man. Other times it was about opportunity. A girl wanted to study, work, or fight, jobs forbidden to her as a woman. So she put on breeches and stepped into a different world, and sometimes it was about identity. People who lived as men for years, not days, who joined monasteries, who took male names, who became part of their communities. Were they trans men in the modern sense? Maybe, maybe not. The language fails us, but what's clear is that they lived as someone other than what they were assigned, and in doing so they reshaped what was possible. One of the most well-known examples is Saint Marinos, or Marina the monk. According to legend, Marina's father didn't want to leave her behind when he joined a monastery, so she disguised herself as a boy and entered the monastic life. She lived there for years, undetected. At one point, she was falsely accused of fathering a child and took the punishment silently, never revealing her identity. Only after her death did the monks discover the truth, and by then she was a saint. Then there's the curious case of Joan of Arc, whose armour and short hair caused almost as much controversy as her visions. During her trial, her refusal to wear women's clothing was brought up again and again. It wasn't just about defiance. It was considered a sin. Her male dress was seen as evidence of heresy, of unnaturalness, and yet she insisted on it. She said it was safer, more appropriate for her role as a soldier, that God approved. They burned her anyway, but not everyone was punished. Some passed so well or lived in such remote places that their stories never made it into the firelight of scrutiny. A peasant woman becomes a brother and tends sheep without question. A butcher's assistant lives as a man for decades, marries a woman, and is only discovered upon death. Sometimes communities look the other way. Sometimes they know and simply don't care, especially if the person is useful, kind, quiet. Survival breeds tolerance in strange places. Still, the risks were high. If you were caught living outside your assigned gender, the consequences range from ridicule to torture. Accusations of deception, charges of heresy. You could be excommunicated or worse, because it wasn't just about clothes. It was about order, about a world view in which men and women had clearly defined roles, and stepping outside of them was seen as dangerous, unnatural. And here's the strange part. The Church actually allowed for some ambiguity, under specific conditions. Female saints who lived as male monks were often venerated after their deaths, once they were no longer threatening. Their cross-dressing was reframed as a form of spiritual sacrifice. Look how she gave up her femininity for God, the texts say. Never mind that she may not have seen it as a sacrifice at all. It was a convenient way to explain away behaviour that didn't fit the mould. This kind of posthumous rebranding happened a lot. Deviance became piety. Dissonance became allegory. A woman who lived as a man wasn't seen as asserting a different identity. She was protecting her purity, hiding from temptation. A tragic figure, not an empowered one. And by the time the Church was done polishing the story, the original person had been buried beneath layers of doctrine and denial. Even in popular culture, gender nonconformity had a role, usually comic, usually cruel. The medieval carnival, for instance, loved to play with gender swapping. Men dressed as women, women as men. Priests mocked themselves in drag. It was seen as subversive, ridiculous, fun. But only because everyone understood it as temporary. Once the mask came off, order was restored. The joke was over. What wasn't allowed was permanence, and yet people still lived it. In convents and monasteries, on ships, in fields, in the gaps between towns. Some may have felt trapped in the wrong body. Others simply refused the roles assigned to them. Some were intersex, assigned a gender by a midwife who couldn't understand what she saw and had to pick something. Their lives are hard to trace, erased, misinterpreted, recast, but they were there, always have been. Modern historians continue to debate these figures. Were they trans? Were they queer? Were they saints or rebels or just survivors? There's no single answer. But what matters is that they existed. They challenged the system with nothing but cloth, posture and silence. And in doing so, they created space. Not much, not enough, but space. So tonight, as you settle under the weight of your blanket and the room folds into stillness, think of someone standing in the morning mist, chest bound, heart steady, walking into a day that does not expect them. A day they'll claim anyway. A life shaped by risk, yes, but also by choice. And in a world that offers you none, that's a kind of miracle. You walk into a room and everything stops. Not because you're famous, not because you're powerful, because you're bleeding, or about to bleed, or suspected of bleeding, and suddenly everyone's got an opinion about your body. The air shifts. Men clear their throats, look away. Women glance sideways, trying to gauge your timing, your smell, your posture. You're not sick. You're just a woman in a world that doesn't understand your bodies and has spent centuries turning that ignorance into fear. This is the anatomy of medieval fear. And at the centre of it, medieval science, if we can call it that, wasn't exactly the shining beacon of progress. Most medical knowledge about women came from ancient sources, copied and recopied through the lens of male anxiety. Galen, Aristotle, Hippocrates, those were the big names. None of them had actually dissected a woman's body. Their theories relied on assumption, hearsay, and some truly wild guesses. And yet their ideas shaped the way medieval Europe understood your body for hundreds of years. Take the uterus, for example. It's not just an organ, it's a creature. Some physicians genuinely believed it could wander, drift around your body like a ghost, bumping into organs, blocking your throat, clouding your mind. If you were hysterical, melancholic, fainting, or even just too emotional, the diagnosis was often wandering womb. Their cure? Smelly herbs, sweet scents near your nose to draw the uterus back down, foul ones near your feet to push it into place, like trying to herd a cat with incense. Then there's menstruation. Medieval scholars couldn't decide if it was a divine punishment, a natural necessity, or a monthly purge of toxins. Some claimed menstrual blood was corrosive, that it could dull mirrors, rust iron, wither crops. There's a charming theory that if a menstruating woman touched wine, it would spoil. Butter, it wouldn't churn bees, they'd die, no pressure. And yet, despite the terror, the bleeding had to happen. If you didn't menstruate, doctors assumed the blood was collecting inside you, rotting, poisoning your body, warping your mind. It was this same thinking that made women inherently colder and wetter than men. Medicine was all about the four humours, and women, by this theory, were unbalanced from birth, more susceptible to illness, more emotional, less rational. Basically, a walking imbalance in need of constant adjustment. And the treatments? Don't get your hopes up. Cupping, bleeding, purging, and potions of dubious origin. You might be fed crushed pearls or powdered animal bones, told to lie still with a live frog strapped to your belly, advised to drink boiled herbs until you vomit or hallucinate. Both signs the treatment is working. Most female ailments were attributed to the womb, regardless of symptoms. Toothache, the womb. Headache, the womb. Irritability, definitely the womb. Here's where it gets worse. Even childbirth, the most sacred female experience, was treated like a terrifying biological mystery. Male doctors wrote about it from a distance, basis-testing their conclusions on second-hand reports from midwives they barely respected. They believed the baby could flip randomly in the womb if the mother had bad thoughts, that loud noises could startle the fetus into the wrong position, that the baby was formed from the man's seed and the woman was just the vessel, less architect, more delivery system. One particularly disturbing theory held that a woman could imprint a deformity on her child just by looking at the wrong thing during pregnancy. See a monkey? Give birth to a monster. Think sinful thoughts? The baby's cursed. Women were blamed for everything that went wrong in childbirth, not because they did anything, but because their minds and bodies were considered unstable. Even anatomy books were suspect. You might imagine elegant drawings of reproductive systems, delicately labelled, but most were vague, symbolic and inaccurate. Some were copied from classical sources over and over, without question. The uterus was drawn as a small oven, complete with doors, sometimes as a vase. In one particularly famous manuscript, it looks like a flask with horns, because that's science, apparently. And this fear bled into law. If a woman miscarried, especially without witnesses, she could be accused of infanticide or witchcraft. If she survived a difficult birth, it was considered divine favour. If she died, it was divine punishment, or worse, a sign of hidden sin. The line between biology and morality blurred until every bodily function became suspect. But here's the thing, women knew better. Not always in scientific terms, but in experience. Midwives passed down real practical knowledge. They knew which herbs helped with pain, which teas soothed cramps, which positions made birth safer. Their anatomy was based on observation, not theory. And yet their knowledge was often dismissed as folk magic or superstition, useful in emergencies, expendable in writing. There's one story of a woman who tried to explain to a male physician what she felt during labour, where the pain moved, what helped, what didn't. He told her she was wrong, that her experience didn't match the books, as if her own body had lied to her. Historians now argue over how much actual influence women had on medieval medical practices. Some claim midwives had far more authority than we assume. Others argue that male physicians gradually pushed them out, seizing control as medicine became more formalised. What's certain is that fear ruled the conversation. Fear of bleeding, of birth, of female power disguised as flesh. And that fear shaped everything. It justified controlling your movements, your dress, your speech, your access to education. Because a woman's body wasn't just misunderstood, it was feared. And fear breeds control. So tonight, as you lie still and your heart slows, think of a girl sitting on a stool while someone presses a stinking poultice to her belly, muttering prayers she doesn't understand. Think of her clenching her teeth, not from pain, but from the knowledge that she knows her body better than any of them, and yet no one's listening. Let the hum of your fan soothe that ache. You're not a vessel. You're not a riddle. You're not their fear. You're just a person. You're standing in the corner of a quiet tavern, half hidden in shadow, listening to the creak of wood and the murmur of voices. You've been here before, more times than anyone would guess, not because you enjoy the ale or the smoke or the heat, but because this is where deals are made, secrets are distributed, and lives, yours included, are negotiated behind closed doors. You're a woman, yes, but tonight you're also a business owner, or a landholder, or a widow with a knife hidden in her skirts. You've learned where the loopholes are, and more importantly, how to slip through them without a sound. Medieval life isn't all iron chains and locked gates. For all its rigid rules and suffocating roles, it's also full of cracks, and where there are cracks, women find ways to live. You've been told your body doesn't belong to you, that your choices are limited, that your place is fixed, but if you're clever, if you're quiet, if you watch closely, you can find the hidden roots. You learn to listen for what isn't said. You learn to speak in gestures, in double meanings. You learn how to bend the system without breaking it, because breaking it gets you burned. Take inheritance laws. On paper, they almost always favour men. Land passes through sons, titles through fathers, but when a man dies suddenly, especially without a male heir, a widow can sometimes step in, temporarily at first, managing the estate until a son comes of age, overseeing harvests, negotiating leases, paying taxes, but sometimes the boy is too young, sometimes he dies, sometimes there is no heir. And the widow? She keeps the books, she learns the rhythms of the land, and eventually she just stays. There are towns where widows run taverns, manage mills, oversee shipping contracts, not because the law welcomes them, but because no one else knows how the place runs. It's easier to tolerate a competent woman than risk chaos, and so she becomes a quiet force, respected behind her back even if no one would dare say it to her face. Then there are the women who trade. Market stalls, cloth production, brewing, midwifery, all technically female professions. But some women push further, they broker deals, lend money, take apprentices, they register their names in town charters, they become visible, and with visibility comes danger, but also power. One famous example, Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century English woman who was part mystic, part businesswoman, part walking scandal. She ran her own brewing business before having a religious conversion, and eventually dictated what's now considered the first English autobiography. In it, she describes resisting her husband's sexual demands by appealing to a local bishop. Yes, legally. Her life is messy, chaotic, controversial, and completely outside the lines she was given. But she made it hers. You also see women exploiting legal contradictions. In some towns, unmarried women could own property. So rather than remarry after widowhood, some chose to stay single, calling themselves femmes souls, operating as legal individuals. In a world where marriage stripped you of legal identity, remaining alone could protect your autonomy. It meant living on the margins, often without protection, but it also meant you owned your name. In places where guilds flourished, like Florence, London, Bruges, some women joined under loopholes. A husband dies and his widow inherits his membership. A daughter helps in the shop and slowly takes over. In theory, guilds were for mere men. In practice, women squeezed in through side doors. Some even trained their daughters, passing down tools and tricks and silent instructions. Don't let them see you measure too confidently, one might whisper. Let them think you're guessing. And don't underestimate the power of the convent, not as a spiritual retreat, but as a site of quiet autonomy. Wealthy families sent daughters there to avoid expensive dowries, but some women chose the convent to escape marriage altogether. Once inside, they could write, teach, manage property, even engage in politics. Some abbesses wielded more real-world power than local lords, commanding lands, labour, and respect. They answered only to the Pope, and sometimes not even him. Here's a wonderfully strange footnote. In parts of medieval Europe, certain women disguised themselves as men within the law. There are records of women petitioning for the right to dress in men's clothing to travel safely or to perform male-dominated jobs. Some were granted permits, temporary licenses to transgress, sanctioned by the very authorities that enforced the rules. It's almost comical. The system was so rigid it created its own loopholes, like a maze so tight it folds in on itself. Even prostitution, as grim as it often was, gave some women financial independence. There are cases of former sex workers buying property, supporting children, even opening bathhouses. It's not a fairy tale, it's survival economics, but it's still a crack in the wall. Of course, not every act of autonomy is recorded. Some women live double lives, respectable by day, radical by night. A midwife who delivers babies and slips birth control advice under the table. A merchant's wife who reinvests profits without telling her husband. A maid who listens at keyholes, sells what she hears, and earns enough to buy her own freedom. Historians still wrestle with the question, how much agency did medieval women really have? Some say the records exaggerate exceptions, painting a few bold outliers as evidence of widespread autonomy. Others argue the opposite, that the quiet acts of independence were so common, they became invisible, unworthy of comment. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps power isn't always loud. So tonight, as the fire in your imagination dies to a slow, steady ember, picture yourself slipping through a side door, keys jingling softly at your waist. You don't wear a crown, you don't hold a sword, but you know the back alleys of your life better than anyone else, and in a world that tried to lock you out, you've made a home behind every unlocked door. Sleep quietly, clever girl. The system was never airtight. The wind smells like damp wool and hot bread, and your hands are chapped from working the fields. Your dress is patched in 5 places, and your feet ache. But the work is done for now. You lean against a fence post to stare out across the open land and think, maybe just for a second, about something more than survival. Something like choice, like control. Because lately something strange has been happening. The rules are still there, yes, but they feel looser at the edges. Not because anyone's given you permission, but because the world itself is changing. Welcome to the economic shift that no one planned but everyone felt. As feudalism begins to crack under the weight of plague, war and rebellion, the grip on women's bodies, especially working-class women, starts to loosen, not all at once, not evenly, but enough to notice, enough to make space. It starts, ironically, with devastation. The Black Hemoth sweeps through Europe in the mid-14th century and kills, depending on the region, up to half the population. Horrifying, yes. Entire villages vanish. But in the aftermath, labour becomes scarce. And suddenly your work matters. You're not just your husband's wife or your father's daughter. You're a labourer, a necessity, someone who can weave, mend, plant, milk, bake, brew, and for the first time in a long time that gives you leverage. Landowners need hands, and they're not picky about whose. Women take jobs that would have been off-limits before, tending flocks, repairing roads, even taking on apprenticeships meant for men. Some demand higher wages, some actually get them. It's not freedom exactly, but it's friction, and friction creates change. In towns it's even more obvious. With men dying or away at war, women step into their businesses. Not quietly, not as a favour, as workers, as owners. In the textile industry especially, women dominate every stage of production, from spinning to dyeing to selling. Guilds still try to shut them out, of course, but they can't ignore them entirely. You can't enforce purity laws when you're running out of soap. This is the beginning of the female labour force becoming visible. Before, you worked in the home, uncounted and undervalued. Now, people see you. They complain about you in letters and legal records. They accuse you of undercutting prices, stealing work from men, corrupting trade. That's how you know you've become a threat. And don't forget the markets. Rural women take their goods, cheese, eggs, herbs, to town and haggle like pros. Some make enough to reinvest, some form informal cooperatives. Some, like in late medieval Flanders, become moneylenders on the side. It's not glamorous, it's not safe, but it's movement. There are records of women owning taverns, mills, breweries and small shops. Some hire others, mum up pass their businesses on to daughters. Some live independently their entire lives. Widows or spinsters by choice. Not because they weren't desirable, but because marriage would have cost them their autonomy. It's not a common path, but it's real. And here's a strange, crunchy little detail. The church didn't know what to do with these women. Female labour wasn't sinful exactly, but it was suspect. A woman who worked too much, who earned too much, who spoke too much in public, she was seen as unfeminine. That was the favourite insult. Unwomanly. Never mind that your hands fed 10 people, or that your income kept the roof up. You'd stepped out of line, and stepping out of line, that's a threat to the whole order. Even the sumptuary laws, the rules about who could wear what, reflected this unease. In some cities, women were banned from wearing silk or gold unless their husbands made a certain income. Why? Because newly wealthy women, especially those who worked, were flaunting their success. Tailors, innkeepers, cloth merchants, they dressed like ladies. And that blurred the lines. Couldn't have that. The nobility, of course, tried to tighten their grip. They doubled down on arranged marriages, on dowry enforcement, on locking women in towers and metaphorical cages. But even there, the seams were stretching. Educated noblewomen began writing letters, a lot of letters, some in Latin, some in verse. They ran households, negotiated inheritances, even acted as diplomats while their husbands were away at war. One Italian noblewoman, Isabella d'Este, ran a court so efficiently that foreign powers wrote directly to her, not her absent husband. No, this wasn't a revolution, but it was a foot in the door. And behind it all, the economy kept shifting, trade expanded, towns grew, banks formed, new jobs appeared, scribes, clerks, textile inspectors, nurses, even bookbinders. Not all were open to women, but some were, enough to matter. In Northern Europe, some women joined Beguine communities, lay sisterhoods that let women live communally, outside of marriage, supporting themselves through work and prayer. Not cloistered, not married, just free-ish. Historians argue about how long this window of relative autonomy lasted. Some say it closed by the 16th century when new waves of religious reform and scientific advancement slammed it shut again. Others say the seeds planted in this era bloomed centuries later, when women's labour movements and suffrage fights took root. Either way, the ripple effect is real, and the fear of that ripple, you can still see it in the backlash. The sudden rise in witch trials, the obsession with enforcing natural roles, the tightening of reproductive control. Whenever women start stepping forward, the powers that be start screaming about morality, about chaos, about what happens when women leave the hearth. It's no coincidence that the loudest cries for purity come right after women begin to taste independence. So tonight, as your mind starts to soften and your breath deepens, picture a woman with her sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, leaning over a ledger by candlelight. Her fingers are stained with ink and flour. Her business is small but steady. No one gave it to her. She claimed it. And no one's taking it back without a fight. You don't always need a sword to start a revolution. Sometimes all it takes is a broom, a coin, and a cracked open window. You wait to the sound of bells, morning mass maybe, or maybe someone's just died. It's hard to tell anymore. You pull your shawl tighter and look out the window, and the world looks both familiar and strange. The buildings are still stone, the streets still muddy, but something is different. The men in charge are speaking with tighter voices, the sermons are longer, the rules are stricter, fear hangs heavier in the air. And you, a woman, are once again the thing they fear the most. Because when systems start to crack, they don't look inward. They look for someone to blame. And that someone, more often than not, is you. This is the late medieval backlash. The system smells change, and it doesn't like it. Women have been visible, too visible, owning property, running businesses, writing, preaching, healing, asking questions, sometimes just existing in public, taking up space that men thought belonged only to them. And so the noose tightens, the walls rise again, but this time they're sharper, hungrier, because this time they come cloaked in something far darker. Accusation. Witchcraft. It's not new exactly. The fear of magical women existed long before, lurking in folklore, whispered behind doors. But by the 15th century it transforms, becomes weaponized, organized, institutional. Suddenly the church, the courts, and the self-proclaimed experts all agree. Women, ordinary everyday women, are making pacts with the devil, flying through the night, spoiling milk, killing children, causing storms, just by existing outside the bounds of what they're told to be. The Malleus Maleficarum, a book whose name sounds like a spell but is really a manual for hunting witches, was written in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors. It quickly spreads across Europe, becoming the go-to guide for identifying, interrogating, and executing supposed witches. And if you flip through it, which you'd only do at your own risk, you'll notice one consistent theme. Women are more susceptible to the devil. Why? Because they're weaker. More emotional, more sexual. Because as one charming passage puts it, she is more carnal than a man. In other words, her body, her desire, her voice, all evidence of guilt. The numbers are staggering. Over the next few centuries, tens of thousands of women, especially older, poor, outspoken, or simply unlucky ones, are accused, tortured, are burned, drowned. They don't have to be midwives or herbalists, though that helps. They don't have to be childless or unmarried, though that helps too. All they really need to do is not fit, not be quiet, not be obedient, not be invisible. The witch hunt is the natural extension of everything we've seen. It's not about magic, it's about control, about punishing female power in any form. You learn to survive by being clever, by finding the cracks. They're trying to fill those cracks with fire now. And yet, something else is brewing. The printing press has arrived. Books are no longer hand-copied luxuries. Ideas can spread faster. Literacy is rising, slowly, unevenly, but rising. Women begin to read, some learn to write. They share letters, diaries and stories. Marginalia in prayer books becomes a kind of resistance, small notes, annotations, little acts of self-expression tucked between the lines of scripture. Even art shifts. Women appear in paintings not just as Madonnas or temptresses, but as people, tired, wrinkled, laughing, reading. They are still idealized, still symbolic, but there's a crack in the lens. Someone is starting to see. And among the rubble, some women keep working. The midwives, despite being labelled as dangerous, continue to care for mothers in secret. The widows keep their shops open, handing down trade knowledge to daughters instead of sons. Some noble women, barred from public life, commission music, libraries and schools. There are even female patrons funding manuscripts that include women's stories. Quietly, strategically. It's not a golden age, it's a battleground. But every step taken by a woman before you makes the road under your feet a little more solid. There's a fierce debate among historians about what the late medieval period meant for women. Was it the start of empowerment or a descent into tighter control? Some point to the witch hunts and say, see, the backlash proved how fragile their gains were. Others point to the rise in female literacy, the records of female-led businesses, the growing visibility in legal documents, and ask, but wasn't that progress too? The answer, frustratingly, is yes to both. That's the truth of it. Gains followed by punishment, freedom followed by crackdown. Women climbed and the system kicked, again and again. But the climbing never stopped. And tonight, you sit with that, with the weight of it, the grind of it. Every woman who came before you made choices with very few choices available. Some knelt, some ran, some fought, some burned, some just endured. And yet somehow, despite all the laws, the sermons, the shame, women kept being human, fully, loudly, against the odds. So as the last page curls and the light in your room softens to gold, you imagine a future not yet written. One where the body you inhabit isn't a curse or a cage, but a home. One where being born female doesn't come with terms and conditions. One where power isn't permission granted from above, but a slow, steady fire lit from within. Breathe into that warmth. Sleep like a woman who's survived empires. So now, lying there in the quiet dark, let your breath settle into rhythm with the night around you. Let the weight of these stories, these women, rest lightly. Not like chains, but like blankets pulled snug against your shoulders. You've travelled a long way tonight, through convents and kitchens, markets and monasteries, courtrooms, birthing stools and gallows. You've stood in the shoes of saints, servants, rebels, mystics, midwives, merchants, and ghosts. You've seen what it costs to live in a body the world tries so hard to control it, and still, you've seen how they lived anyway. That's the through line, isn't it? They lived. Not perfectly, not peacefully, not always by choice, but they made space for themselves in corners and cracks, in whispered prayers and quiet refusals. They made homes inside systems designed to exclude them. They carved out power from the very things used to oppress them. And though they weren't always safe, or free, or remembered by name, they were real, and they are still with you in the ways you may not even realise. The laws that tried to bind their bodies have shifted. The language has changed. The cages are newer, smoother, but some bars remain. But so do the blueprints for resistance. You've inherited every small rebellion, every stolen moment of joy, every time a woman said no when the world demanded yes. These aren't just history lessons, they're survival guides. So if your shoulders feel a little stronger now, it's because you've carried centuries tonight. Let yourself rest, let your body be yours, and if you dream, may it be of wide fields, unlocked doors, and a voice, maybe your own, whispering, I was always more than they let me be. Good night, wild heart.